Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
Chapter 28 Magic, Beyond the Wall, Cave of the Three-Eyed Crow, Arthur, 278 AC. The smoke from the small fire rose in spirals before disappearing among the massive roots hanging from the ceiling. The only sound was the dripping of water somewhere deep in the stone and the dry crackle of the ember. Leaf stood on the other side of the flames. Her small shoulders were slumped as she watched the embers. When she spoke, her voice sounded like dry leaves dragged against the stone. The singers of the earth dispense with the word magic. She pushed a pebble closer to the fire with her bare foot. That is a man's term for what the human mind refuses to accept. What we do is listen. The earth has blood and veins, just as you do. We learn to speak the language of those veins. Nothing more. Kevin chewed on a piece of meat and grimaced. This meat tastes like dirt. Leaf ignored the soldier. Everything tastes like dirt. You simply forgot. A branch popped in the heat. Arthur fixed his gaze on her. His gray and violet eyes remained still. The hammer of the waters, he said. Her shoulders dropped a little further. She went silent. The weight of centuries occupied the space where hesitation should be. When the first men came, Leaf began, her voice dropping lower. We asked the earth to drown them. The sea swallowed them and the ancient stone bridge disappeared along with them. She looked at the flames. The earth answered, and the earth exacts a toll for every service. Each time we called too deeply, the debt increased. We knew this. We believed the sacrifices would settle the difference. Hunts, offerings, blood spilled at the feet of the weirwoods. It was insufficient, Arthur said. It was insufficient. She crossed her 4 fingers over her chest. What the earth does not receive in sacrifice, it takes in seed. Our wombs dried up, one by one, then all at once. The last singer of the earth was born over a century ago. Kevin stopped chewing. The second use at the neck finished what was left of us, Leaf continued, her golden eyes rising to Arthur's face. When the Andals felled the weirwoods in the south, they severed the veins that still fed us. Every heart tree cut down was one less connection. We suffocated slowly, in the dark, for centuries. Arthur remained motionless, until your first cry. Her voice changed, becoming stranger and deeper. The earth listened when you were born. Dead seeds in the south tore through the stone again. Ancient weirwoods drank the light once more. The weight on our chests eased a fraction just because you draw breath. Perseus, leaning against the stone wall with his arms crossed, looked up. He remained silent. To cure the rotten root for good, Leaf continued, taking a silent step toward the flames, the earth demands an absolute payment. Certain invocations rewrite the rules of the world and exact a toll heavier than an offering. The hammer of the waters bought an impossible change. The price exceeded the immediate sacrifice and became a debt. We paid with fertility, with numbers, with connection. Her golden eyes locked onto Arthur's mismatched eyes. You carry the blood of 3 kings in your veins. The strength of royal blood ignores genetics. That power flows from the weight of millions of lives who believed in it, who died for it, who prayed using that name. That density constitutes the only heavy coin for the earth. Arthur watched the ashes for a moment. Therefore, taking the blood of any royal relative would fail. The same blood carries distinct weights. The density belongs to accumulated history, chemistry is irrelevant. Leaf tilted her head. Yes, a branch can come from the same tree and never have supported anything. The taproot supports centuries. The new branch carries only days. Arthur stood up. The leather of his boots creaked against the uneven floor. He stood looking at the embers, his back to Leaf. Flamel wrote that the philosopher's stone displaced impurity to another place. Dee utilized the angelic language as a command interface. Paracelsus understood that poison and cure share the same substance, the measure and the destination define the difference. He turned his face to the fire. The violet and gray eyes caught the glow of the embers from different angles. The rule governing all of this is simple, Arthur said, his voice echoing in the stone acoustics. Nothing emerges from the void. Nothing vanishes without leaving a balance elsewhere. Crowley called it will, Levi called it astral, Paracelsus called it quintessence. The name changes, the mechanics remain. He turned to Leaf. Every gain exacts a loss at another point. You imported order into the physical world when you used the hammer. The corresponding disorder migrated to the bloodline, to the seed, to the capacity to generate new life. The cost was redirected. Kevin crossed his arms, frowning. The others represent physical stagnation, Arthur continued, his gaze drifting to the dark rear of the cave. The absence of heat is merely the symptom. What they embody is the absolute death of movement. Where they tread, the earth stops breathing, the water stops flowing, the blood freezes. He paused briefly, and the debt sustaining them surpasses yours. The hammer of the waters issued a gigantic invoice, but others existed. The great empire of the dawn manipulated absurd forces and paid with their own extinction. Forgotten civilizations exported the cost of their miracles far from their present. Centuries of accumulated imbalance across the entire world were compressed until they took shape. He faced Leaf. They are the final toll. The bill for a world that preferred to delay the price. Levi argued that certain forces demand transmutation. Dee viewed the equilibrium of the universe as an eternally open equation. Flamel spent decades seeking the perfect displacement of cost to the point of least ruin. Arthur raised his eyes to the creature. The solution repudiates the blood of the living. Repeating that sacrifice is committing the same ancestral mistake. The cost contaminates the future and the bill returns larger. He took a step toward the center of the cave, his voice cold and cutting. The annihilation of the White Walkers will settle the debt. They are the massive imbalance accumulated by the ruptures of the past. If they are the toll, their destruction closes the system. Death itself will pay for life. The ensuing silence weighed heavily on the stone. From the depths of the hall, Brynden Rivers opened his red eye. Theory is an elegant armor, Arthur. The voice rasped inside their heads, present everywhere. The gears of the world grind those who try to stop them. Theory does not bleed. Arthur tightened his grip on truth's hilt. The Valyrian steel was freezing against his palm. Then I will be the iron that breaks the gears. Arthur stood still. The silence of the cave returned to the dripping of water and the hiss of the dying ember. When I touched the wall, he said, without preamble, I felt the structure of the seal. The runes of the first men inside the ice, the roots of the children anchored in the foundation stone, the sacrifices that still pulse after millennia. He turned his gaze to Leaf. I felt a flaw, a minuscule fissure in the very fabric of the seal. Through it, the miasma bleeds south. The same heavy air I breathed since crossing the border leaks slowly to the other side. Leaf settled near the embers. She tucked her knees beneath her body, her golden eyes fixed on the fire. The wall ignores the nature of common ice, she began. Each block required precise cuts. Each inner face bears runes we took generations to master. Those marks function as absolute locks. Each rune seals a crossing point, blocks a frequency and tethers the cold to the north. Her fingers traced an arc in the air. The magical stabilization of a colossal structure required extreme sacrifices. Human blood fed the earth for decades, spilled on the foundations and the roots we planted beneath the ice. The earth needed blood to support the weight of the seal. Kevin dropped the bone on the floor. When the work ended, Leaf continued, the north imprisoned the cold. The seasons to the south recovered their natural rhythm. Predictable cycles, temporary winters, regular summers. The wall divided two forms of time. In the fissure, Arthur prompted. That, Leaf said, I cannot answer alone. The thickest root emerging from Brynden Rivers' throne shifted. The sound of old wood tearing filled the chamber. Come, Brynden said. Arthur walked to the throne. The roots around the old man were dense and white as dry bone. They entered Brynden's flesh at the shoulders, thighs, and neck. Not a single drop of blood stained the wood. The body had absorbed the tree. Brynden raised a trembling hand. The thin fingers extended with the palm facing up. Hold. Arthur closed his hand around the old man's fingers. The ice attacked before any image. A cold born from within. It ignored temperature, possessing an absolute weight, the sensation of something pushing the ribs from the bottom up. The night fort appeared in its ancient glory. Solid towers, unbreakable walls, courtyards where hundreds of men in black marched with the discipline of those inhabiting an eternal bastion. Arthur observed everything from above, pure attention floating over the dark stone. The 13th Lord Commander stood atop the wall, broad shoulders silhouetted against the white sky, dark hair falling below the nape of his neck and the heavy jaw of someone born to swallow blizzards. The hood of the black cloak rested on his shoulders. The prominent bones, the square chin, and the gray eyes analyzed the horizon. He demonstrated pure recognition. An unmistakable Stark. The woman appeared next, skin white as a new moon and blue eyes the color of distant stars squeezed into the iris. She materialized in silence. The Lord Commander turned his face to her. His expression changed drastically, the surrender of a blind man to his own fall. The vision cut. 13 fragmented years. Sworn brothers obeyed empty orders, trapped in automaton bodies. Sacrifices in the Nightfort's courtyard. The offered blood belonged to brothers of the Watch. Men brought to their knees and delivered to a lethal void. At the wall, the rupture tore the fabric beneath the ice. The bond between the Lord Commander and the woman functioned as a rusted key forcing the wrong lock. The opening bypassed external aggressions. The structure collapsed from the inside out. The fissure resembled a strand of hair in thick glass. The miasma began to leak. The vision advanced. The night fort in agony. Recruits went mad in the shadows. The rat cook butchered a prince and served the meat with alien hands. Danny Flint agonized in the dark. 79 sentinels were sealed in the ice, breathing as the stone swallowed them in the name of duty. The mad axe slaughtered sleeping brothers without understanding his own fury. The curses of King Sherrod impregnated the stones with the bile of an extinct people. The rupture dispensed with complex spells. The accumulated weight of atrocities corrupted the foundations. Every drop of innocent blood forced the crack a millimeter wider. The vision ended. Arthur released Brendan's hand and stepped back. The cavern floor took a second to steady beneath his boots. Kevin watched him, tense and prepared. The Night's King provoked the first flaw, Arthur said, his voice harsh. His alliance with the creature corrupted the inner lock of the seal. The fissure was born there. He wiped his palm on his trousers, scraping off Brendan's cold. From that point on, the weight of the massacres at the Night Fort expanded the damage. The corruption of the soil broke the stone's resistance. Leaf nodded. The miasma finds the gaps of suffering. Pain tears the door open. The fissure has been leaking south for centuries, Arthur reasoned. And what does it hold back? The original seal balanced the continent, Leaf explained. Blocking the cold allowed the earth to the south to breathe. Since the opening of the flaw, the miasma pollutes the border. The imbalance crosses the wall. Summer dies early and winter devours the years. The seasons, Arthur murmured. Yes, the endless winters are merely the symptom of the broken seal. The world was not born broken. The world bled from a wound. The absence of climatic predictability was pure magical degradation. Restoring the seal locks the cold in the north, Arthur concluded. The miasma halts, and the south recovers the cycles. The earth possesses a long memory. The process will require entire cycles, but the rhythm will return, Leaf assured. Brendan Rivers closed his red eye. A shadow of relief softened the wrinkles of the three-eyed raven. The weight of a secret kept for entire lifetimes finally shared. The Night Fort demands absolute purification before the stitching, Brendan warned, his voice like gravel. The blood poisoned the foundations. The wound must bleed out the pus. And the ceiling, Arthur demanded. How do you weld a fissure of that level? Silence swallowed the chamber. The wall requires recognition, Leaf said, staring at the embers. The original sacrifice bound the builders to the stone. Only the blood of the foundation locks the door. Her golden eyes met Arthur's. The bloodline of the original architects beats in your chest. Arthur remained motionless. Brandon the builder. The bones buried in the crypt of Winterfell. The statue with gray eyes in the dark. First we cleanse the Night Fort, Arthur sentenced. Then, the seal. Brendan Rivers made no sound. The thick roots around the throne pulsed once, slow and heavy, sealing the agreement in silence. Chapter 29 Farewell. Beyond the wall, Cave of the Three-Eyed Crow, 278 AC. Leaf handed over the bowl the next morning. The rim had faces carved into the bark, the same agonized features engraved on the heart trees. The liquid was dark amber, almost black, and by the light of the torches, it turned blood red without being blood. It is not the same mixture you used. Leaf held the bowl with her four-fingered hands. How did Brendan? No one told me anything, child. From the moment you arrived, I felt the magic in your body and in your companions. We use weirwood magic, do you think I wouldn't recognize it? But the one you produced is surprisingly powerful. Different from this one here. Only a greenseer can endure what is in this bowl intact. You will not be the successor of the last. Time has broken that line. But you will be a powerful warg. Kevin, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, raised a finger. So does he turn into an animal for good, or just sometimes? Kevin. Astrid frowned and, without looking at him, elbowed the mercenary in the ribs. Ouch. Aggressive woman. He brought his hand to his ribs, grimacing. I brought the rim to my lips and drank. The bitterness of old root and earth hit my tongue immediately, clinging to the back of my throat without asking permission. Then, the flavor changed. Something clean and cold came, fresh fallen snow and dark honey. Then pepper. Then cinnamon. The liquid seemed to know in what order to present each thing. I drank it all down to the last drop, leaving only a few reddish stains in the hollows of the carved faces. Leaf and the child of the forest that Kevin had named Snowwylocks, for her white hair, extinguished the torches one by one. The darkness swallowed the chamber. My consciousness slipped into the roots before I even understood I was falling. Winterfell materialized. The courtyard was covered in clean snow, without marks of use or carriage ruts. The low sun gave the granite a honeyed color. I recognized my father, Rickard Stark, a few years younger, with a smile that rarely appeared on his face and that softened the hard lines of the lordship. He waited on the steps of the great hall, looking toward the castle entrance. The moment I laid eyes on the person stepping down from the carriage, I already knew who she was. All the rumors about her did not match reality. Rhaenyra Pendragon was even more stunning than any description. She was absurdly beautiful, with a natural quality that made the eyes stop without permission. Her silver white hair fell over her dark fur cloak with calm grace. She raised her eyes to Rickard and smiled. It was the smile of someone who makes the day lighter just by being present. I wanted to stay there longer, just looking at her. But the vision shifted. A slender girl stood on her tiptoes, kissing a knight with the towering height and brute width of Sigurd. The man's armor bore deep marks from old blades. Strapped to his back, a shield displayed a green shooting star above an elm tree at sunset. I recognized the coat of arms immediately. By his sheer wingspan and the emblem, it was Sir Duncan the Tall. The young northern girl he was kissing was a mystery. I couldn't associate her face with any known name or lineage. The vision shifted again. A robust young man with brown hair was arguing in the courtyard. Beside him, a youth with eyes as gray as a winter storm, wearing furs with a direwolf embroidered on the chest. Near them, a woman with brown hair falling in dense curls and eyes that mixed dark gray with hints of blue. She wore fine fur garments cut to measure, analyzing the environment in silence. Heavy carriages creaked over the snow. Red and black banners snapped in the wind. A colossal shadow swallowed the sun. Claws crushed the stone of the wall as the silver-scaled beast landed. The wind stalled beneath the dragon's weight. The woman advanced through the courtyard with absolute calm. Her hood slipped back, revealing strands of pale silver and gold over her white ermine cloak. Amethyst eyes fixed on the steps of the great hall. High above, the lord of the castle waited. His dark beard and gray stone eyes carried the weight of a recent loss. The Stark's posture displayed the rigidity of an ancient oak, without retreating a single millimeter. My consciousness slipped again. The wind hid my feathers. I was inside a raven, the air beneath the wings turning into pure information about thermal currents. The scenery shrank and the smell of wet earth flooded my snout. I jumped into a pup, of what I supposed to be a large hound, its disproportionate legs scraping the ground, instinct focused on the urgency of the present. The transition accelerated into the self-sufficiency of a kitten, evaluating the distance of a jump with cold precision. Then another raven, more patient, burying its claws into a dry branch. I opened my eyes. The smell of smoke and the dampness of the cave filled my lungs. Leaf was right, you are certainly a powerful greenseer, young Arthur. A pity you are not my successor, so that I could finally rest. Bryndon's voice scraped from the back of the chamber. Every animal that touched your consciousness will recognize it next time. The bond is forged. Distance will no longer matter. Congratulations, it seems you have gained new companions. Time lost its meaning in the following months. Leaf taught the true tongue, her species' native language. The language repudiated human biology, demanding the cracks of old wood, the rustle of leaves, and the hiss of water running over stones. I spat dark blood until my throat burned, forcing my vocal cords to replicate the sound of the earth. The pain burned at the base of my neck in a continuous ember. She also taught the runes. The others tried to learn as well, not the true tongue, for few would have the qualification for it, but runes and other types of magic, along with methods of using nature to their advantage. The foundation I had taught them, Leaf destroyed without ceremony. You use runes as dead tools, she said as Kevin tried to carve a rune into his knife. A knife is a tool for cutting, but it is also the promise that the cut is possible. Runes are the promise. They are conversations, not commands. The consequence bleeds later. So basically all magic is a way of making contracts with the world, Kevin noted, without looking up from the blade. Yes, you must give to receive. Leaf fixed her golden eyes on him. Understood, Professor. Kevin returned his gaze to the blade. There were days when the teaching spilled over the edges. One afternoon, Leaf asked me to try projecting myself into a raven perched at the cave's entrance. I slipped out of my own body, spent a quarter of a second seeing the cave from above, and then the raven simply took flight, dragging my consciousness along for half a minute of pure aerial panic before I managed to snap back. I warned you he was going to fly, Leaf said, without looking away from what she was carving into the stone. You didn't warn me about anything, I replied, blowing my bloodied nose. I warned you in the true tongue. You still don't understand everything. Technically, she's right, Kevin commented, leaning against the wall. The north holds more than ice. Brendan's red eye stared at the wall without focusing on anything. Blind men march over fortunes while starving to death. Beneath the lands of the Umbers and the Karstarks, the ground hides reserves of coal and veins of iron. Sea Dragon Point harbors deposits of silver and copper. A pause. The roots around the throne creaked. But none compared to the Bolton lands. I remained quiet. The Dreadfort doesn't just sit atop extensive iron mines. The entire expanse of the Bolton domains hides riches that the other lords of the north cannot even imagine. Veins of gold in the hills near the Weeping Water. Coal in the caves beneath Gallows Hill. And the new lord, I said, weighing the information. Eldrick had to leave early because he received word that the former Lord Bolton had died in strange ways. Then he wrote to me saying that the new Lord Bolton, Roose, was someone who should be constantly watched. After that, I had no more information. Roose Bolton is ambitious and very dangerous. Brendan closed his red eye for a second. Apathetic. He shows no emotion whatsoever, except perhaps with those disgusting leeches of his. The death of the former lord is suspicious because it was Roose himself who killed him. Make no mistake, he is pragmatic. He knows the downsides of generating constant fear, so he does his best to ensure there is no gossip. A peaceful land, a quiet people, is what he says. The silence that followed carried a different weight. Brendan rarely hesitated to describe what he saw. When he did, the reason was never pleasant. It is the better path to try and frame him rather than assassinate him directly. With his father's recent death, another corpse in the family would be far too suspicious, Brendan said, the political sagacity of years at court slipping between the words. If you need motives, there are some. He still practices the first night. The old man's voice came out drier than usual. Not as a custom of old. As an exercise of power. He chooses his brides by whatever criteria suit him. Those who resist disappear. The families learn not to ask. I did not answer immediately. I stared at the stone floor. In the flaying, Brendan continued, his voice devoid of warmth. Not just as a punishment. As a demonstration, he chooses who to flay with the same criteria a butcher chooses a cut. Calm, calculated. Sometimes he makes sure the family watches. Only to die right after. The old Red Kings ruled like that. Before Brandon the Breaker forced them to bend the knee, I commented. The problem isn't what he does now. It's what he's planning. A short pause. From personal experience, one should never expect anything good from people like that. That type only waits for the right moment to drive a knife into your back. It seems winter is coming for House Bolton. I raised my head, meeting his gaze. When I return to the south, that lineage will be extirpated. The fire crackled in the cave. But I cannot kill the Boltons and leave a void, I continued. The richest lands in the north cannot be left without a guiding hand. When the time comes, there must be someone trustworthy at the Dreadfort. Someone who understands that those riches serve the north, not just one house. Brendan did not answer. His expression said he knew the answer but was unwilling to speak it. One more thing. Call everyone here, Brendan ordered. They all gathered before the root throne. Sigurd, Pursue, Kevin, Astrid, Leaf, Snowhylox, and a few of the children of the forest who were now learning to speak the common tongue. Ash, Black Knife, and Cole. We must plan what to do with the free folk. They are fragmented and marching toward death, Brendan decreed, his voice coming from everywhere at once. Every corpse in the snow is an added soldier to the army of the others. You must unify them before the final storm. By choice. We will start with the giants. I traced the map in the dirt with the pommel of my dagger. An alliance with them changes the math for any smaller tribe. With the giants on our side, the lesser tribes will bend the knee out of pragmatism. I sheathed the dagger. I have things to do in the north and beyond. I need someone to volunteer for this task. Everyone looked at Sigurd. The half-giant snorted. I came south when I was a boy. To the clans, I'll just be a very large southerner. But I'm willing. I placed my hands on Sigurd's broad shoulders, squeezed lightly, and nodded, sealing the choice. After a few seconds of silence, Astrid took a step forward. I'll go with him, she decided. You are too hot-headed. You'll end up dead before any negotiation. I'll keep you in line. Sigurd's expression softened slightly. He had someone to help him carry the tactical burden. Thank you, Astrid, Sigurd said with a brief smile. Snowhylox took a step forward. I will accompany them. We are friends to the giants, I know how to deal with them. And the free folk are very superstitious. As soon as they see me, they'll be more submissive, she said, struggling slightly with the common tongue. Holy shit, you're almost a four-fingered goddess, Kevin raised an eyebrow. And the most impressive part was that Snowhylox actually seemed to blush at the compliment. The farewell came the next morning, emptying the cave of sound. Leaf, Brynden ordered from the throne. Bring that. The creature emerged with a bow carved from pale weirwood and a thick cloth bundle. She handed both to me without a word. I have one last favor to ask. Brynden's voice was weaker than usual, like wood nearly consumed by fire. I brought this sword out of pure spite, and the time has come to right that wrong. Return the steel to its rightful owners. Your judgment is sharp. Give the blade to whoever truly deserves it. The bow is to compensate you for the service. I unrolled the cloth. The scabbard displayed stiff black leather, locked by matte steel rings. The crossguard jutted out in sharp angles like folded wings. The slender hilt had been forged to guarantee speed for a woman's hand. The metal slid out with a clean hiss. The narrow blade bore rippling patterns, lead-green melted with absolute black, the steel looking like petrified smoke that devoured the cave's light. The edge gleamed from base to tip. Can you feel it, can't you? Brynden asked. Yes, I replied, feeling the weapon's balance. Dark Sister demands blood. The red eye fixed on me. She always has, but it has been a long time since she tasted it. I nodded to Brynden and extended my hand in a silent farewell. Thank you for everything, old man. Are you sure you don't want to come with us? My destiny is here. I am already nearing the end of my journey, and I look forward to reuniting with my brothers and my beloved. Brynden paused. But I will survive for a few more years. If you need to contact Sigurd, you know how to find me. I will pass the message to him. Be well. I'll give your sword to someone worthy, I affirmed. Leaf accompanied the group to the exit, where the gray light touched the outermost roots. She stood at the threshold, her golden eyes on my face. She spoke in the true tongue. Go ahead, my sisters and I will follow later. The cold crushed us outside the cave. The wind howled through the black pines, heralding the imminent storm. I've been thinking about something since Rosalind gave us the coats with Yggdrasil carved into them. I let the words fill the silence between the whistling wind. I thought of creating a sort of order. A group, or a family, whatever you want to call it. Just like in the stories I told you, Yggdrasil had 9 realms. And since we are all part of the same tree, each of you will have your realm. I nodded to Kevin. The mercenary slid silently behind Sigurd and kicked the giant hard in the back of the knee. The leg gave way with a dull thud, forcing the mountain of muscle down to his knees in the hard snow. Before Sigurd could growl or try to get up, I drew truth from its scabbard and rested the flat of the blade firmly on his left shoulder. The cold of the metal and the weight of the gesture kept him pinned in place. Your domain is Jotunheim, my voice cut through the wind. The land of primordial ice, of unyielding rock and relentless fury. The realm of giants, forged to break what the world of men cannot withstand. I tightened my grip on truth. Before this tree and the brothers that surround you, do you swear to be our unbreakable vanguard? Do you swear to raise your axe without hesitation against any force that opposes us? Do you swear to be the living wall where the charge of our enemies will shatter, spilling your own blood before taking a single step back on the battlefield? Sigurd's jaw locked. His irritation at the trip disappeared. His eyes met mine with a loyal ferocity. I am the wall, Sigurd growled from deep in his throat, his voice sounding like crushing stones. I do not retreat, I swear it. I lifted truth and brought the flat of the blade down on his right shoulder. Then may your arm be ruin and your chest be insurmountable. May fear march before you and death walk in your shadow. I consecrate you as Jotunheim, the primordial strength of our blood. Rise, brother. Sigurd stood up, rubbing the back of his knee while casting a lethal glare at Kevin. The mercenary merely winked. I turned to Astrid. She didn't wait for a signal. She took a step forward, unfastened her shield, planted the wooden base into the snow, and knelt gracefully on one leg. Her chin was held high, her eyes locked on mine, shining with icy intensity. I raised truth and rested the flat of the blade on her left shoulder. Your domain is Niflheim, the realm of impenetrable mist and absolute resilience. In the old stories, it was the Valkyries who descended upon the carnage to decide who stood tall and who bled out. And Brynhildr was the greatest of them, the warrior who did not bend her spine for gods or kings. I pressed down lightly with the steel. Before this tree and the blood that unites us, do you swear to be our shield and our clarity? Do you swear to hold the line intact when chaos dominates the battlefield? Do you swear to be the relentless winter that guards our flanks, refusing to break, no matter the size of the tide that comes against us? Ice does not bend, Astrid replied, her voice as sharp as broken glass. I hold the line, I do not break, I swear it. I lifted truth and brought the blade down on her right shoulder. Then may your guard be iron and your mind be winter itself. May our enemies freeze before your advance, and may your blade always be exact. I consecrate you as Niflheim, the unbreakable shield of our pack. Rise, sister. She rose in a fluid motion. I sheathed truth. I took the pale weirwood bow and extended it toward Kevin. The mercenary stopped chewing his dried meat. He wiped his hands on his leather pants with uncharacteristic slowness. When he took the weapon, his arrogance vanished. He tested the tension of the string. The hum was dry, lethal in the freezing air. Heart tree wood, Kevin murmured, testing the curve. Not a single arrow will be wasted, Arthur. Not one. Sigurd stopped in front of Kevin. He locked his eyes on the bow. Fine wood, Sigurd growled, his breath forming thick smoke in the cold. If you miss a single shot while you're watching the boss's back, I swear I'll come down from the deep north just to break that bow over your skull. You know I don't miss, big guy. Just worry about not getting chewed up by something bigger than you up there. Kevin didn't back down. He smirked from the corner of his mouth. Sigurd turned and stood before Pursue. He extended his hand, his grip swallowing the other man's forearm. Keep him alive. Sigurd's breath formed thick clouds. If I come down south and find you dead, I'll kill the culprits and then go down to hell to collect from both of you. Try not to get trampled by a mammoth, Pursue replied, his jaw tight. I'm not crossing the wall to fetch your corpse. Astrid struck her closed fist against Pursue's shoulder and nodded to Kevin. Keep the flank clear, she said. We'll clear the front. Then she walked up to me. She closed the distance and squeezed the side of my neck and shoulder with her gloved hand, the hard touch anchored in what she never put into words. Her eyes shone. We will bend the free folk. Her voice came out low, cutting through the wind. When the storm truly hits, you will have them all. We will return. I covered her hand with mine, squeezing the cold leather. Keep Sigurd focused, and stay alive, Astrid. I need the whole pack. She nodded, swallowed hard, stepped back and mounted in a fluid motion, securing her shield. Snowwylocks sat behind her, wrapped in thick furs. Sigurd stopped in front of me last. The giant looked at me with the respect of one who recognizes the leader of the hunt. We break the ice, Sigurd said, his voice sounding like dragged gravel. You set up the rest of the board, Arthur. See you in the middle of the carnage. Make the clans kneel, I ordered. Sigurd pulled the reins. He looked back once, nodded. They moved forward. I stood in the snow with Kevin and Pursue, watching as the white mist of the haunted forest swallowed Sigurd's broad shoulders, Astrid's shield, and the small figure of Snowwylocks. A metallic emptiness settled in my stomach. The silence left behind was suffocating. Chapter 30 Returning. The departure of Sigurd and Astrid left a vacuum in the formation, a physical absence that bothered like the phantom itch of an amputated limb. The body felt their presence there, waiting for movement in the field of vision, but the flanks remained empty and silent beneath the weight of the mist. One day we will meet again, I told myself, trying to soothe the thick unease settling at the bottom of my stomach. It was the metallic taste Alexander and the other generals described in the Elysian fields, the burden of sending soldiers into the field without the certainty of their return. No use overthinking it, I trained them for this. They are capable enough to see the mission through. I adjusted the reins, the leather hardened by the cold. Snowflakes melted as they touched the skin of my face and froze again before sliding down my neck, creating a rough crust. The wind of the haunted forest hit head-on, howling between the dead trunks and occupying the space on our trail. Kevin and Perseus kept the pace right behind, their silhouettes hunched against the gray fog that swallowed everything around, marking the beginning of the 8-day journey back to Whitetree. Kevin rode loose in the saddle, his body swaying in a posture that ignored the biting air. A sharp, melancholy whistle slipped through his lips, rising and falling in time with his mount before losing itself in the frozen canopy. If the wind keeps howling like this, we'll arrive in Whitetree looking like ice statues, he said, interrupting the tune for a moment to scrape the frost gathering on his upper lip with his thumb. Perseus cast a sideways glance, the muscles in his shoulders tensing the bearskin that covered him, but the archer merely winked a blue eye and resumed the melody with the same ease. The sound died when Sleipnir stopped abruptly, locking the muscles of his front legs in the thick snow. The horse's ears swiveled forward with the precision of a compass. A loud snort blew from his nostrils, and the hot breath clashed with the frigid air, raising a thick cloud of steam. I dismounted without a sound, feeling the white crust yield beneath my boots. I drew the Valyrian steel dagger and walked toward an outcropping of black rocks at the edge of the trail. Kevin quickly drew his new weirwood bow, nocked an arrow, and slipped off his horse to circle the perimeter. Perseus sheathed his sword, dismounted, and followed me. A few steps in, a ragged hiss cut through the stillness, immediately followed by a muffled snarl. I moved closer to the noise and soon saw them. A direwolf pup and a black cat were tangled on the ground. The wolf bore a coat of such absolute black it seemed to swallow the dim light of the forest, using the weight of its paws to pin the cat against the stone. She slipped out from under each strike, sliding across the snow with an absurd, insulting agility. When my shadow covered the outcropping, the fight ceased. The cat backed away and arched her spine, first standing on end from the nape of her neck to the base of her tail. The wolf lowered his center of gravity, scraping his chin on the ice, and raised his head in my direction, revealing irises like red rubies, alive and entirely still. I crouched near the rocks. I pulled my right glove off with my teeth and held my palm open near the ground. The wolf's wet snout touched my skin first, and the cat's rough tongue came to rasp against my fingers a second later. A strong vibration ran down the base of my neck, the exact texture and essence I had felt during the trance in the cave, now gaining weight, scent, and physical form. I pulled 2 pieces of dried meat from my pouch. The wolf devoured his share in a single bite, planting wide paws that already betrayed the terror of his lineage. The cat pulled the meat with fine teeth and savored it slowly, with conscious elegance. "Finally found you, or rather, you found me, pup," I said, rubbing the wolf's small head. He rolled onto his back in the snow, belly exposed, clearly asking to be pet. "Ha ha ha, looks like you enjoy a good scratch, boy," I said, now knowing the wolf's sex. "And you," I said, moving my hand over the cat's fur. I soon noticed the white stripes crossing her coat, which I had previously mistaken for snow. A shadow cat, I thought, surprised. Just like the wolf pup, the cat rolled onto her back. "A girl, then," I said, smiling. "You need names. How about Fenrir?" I said, looking into the large animal's red irises. I turned my face to his black companion. "And you will be Hela." "Marvelous," Kevin commented, stepping out from the trees. He stopped a few paces from the rocks, resting his hands on his hips and flashing his usual crooked smile. "Now you just need 2 ravens and an eye patch, and you're Odin." Perseus crouched beside me and let Hela walk up to him. The cat sniffed his stained leather glove and bumped her small body against the warrior's thick legs. His calloused fingers hesitated before descending to the black neck. A rhythmic purr echoed in the freezing air. I scooped Fenrir up, feeling the dense weight of muscle and bone still forming, while Perseus lifted Hela. "It seems the gods don't want us alone. Let me introduce you. This big boy here is Fenrir, and this girl is Hela," I said, approaching the spot where the horses waited. I presented both to Sleipnir, who snorted again, steam billowing from his nostrils. "I think he likes you," I said with a faint smile, running a hand over Sleipnir's head. On the 6th day of the march, the beating of large wings broke the constant silence of the north. A massive raven dove from the gray mist and dug its claws into the leather on my left shoulder. Seconds later, another bird plummeted from the white sky and seized my right shoulder. The weight distributed itself symmetrically, and the connection snapped shut at my neck like a tight noose, carrying a cold, ancient, and dual perception. "Curse my mouth," Kevin said. He rubbed his bowstring with his thumb, eyeing the birds with clear discomfort. "Looks like our other companions have arrived," I told Fenrir and Hela, who were keeping warm inside my coat. I extended my arm, and the 2 ravens hopped onto it, their claws squeezing my arm. Had I not been wearing thick furs, they probably would have cut skin. They were nearly identical, the only difference being a small white patch on the right one's chest. "You will be Hugin," I said, stroking the entirely black raven's small head. "And you will be Moonin," I said, now stroking the head of the raven with the white patch on its chest. As soon as I finished naming them, they both took flight and settled on a branch, watching us. "They scare me," Kevin said. "Everything scares you, Kevin," Perseus replied with a slight edge of disdain. The white canopies of white tree pierced through the fog at the end of the 8th day. Morgause dropped a bundle of firewood on the packed earth the moment we entered the camp, and Belzakar stopped immediately beside him. The eyes of the two Exunsullied swept over us, registering my presence, Kevin's, and Perseus. The scrutiny paused at the empty space left by Sigurd and Astrid, but their postures remained rigid. Their faces held the tactical neutrality Slaver's Bay had burned into their bones. "Arthur, how are you?" Belzakar asked, his voice flat and devoid of oscillation. "I am well, my friends. And you, how are things here?" I asked them both. "All is well. We had minor friction with some of the free folk, but it has been resolved," Belzakar answered. "Did the giant or the girl fall?" Morgause asked. "They are alive," I replied, dismounting from Sleipnir and kicking the snow from my boots. "They left to fulfill missions on another front." The two exchanged a single peripheral glance and confirmed the report with a short nod. The matter was closed. I walked to the huts where Tova and Fjorn stood. "Tova, Fjorn." I unhooked the sack from my belt and placed it in Tova's hands. "Silver coins, a fair amount of them. We know how scarce things are here. Taking in more mouths for weeks is no small thing. I apologize for the burden we left." Tova weighed the sack in her hand without opening it. Belzakar and Morgause brought enough game. 2 deer, a boar. The women helped with the curing, repairing the nets, tending the sick children. She gave a short nod. It was no burden. They helped a lot. Fjorn nodded without speaking. He had the posture of a man who confirms with his body what his wife has already said with words. "The coins will serve to trade with the rangers when they pass through. Salt, iron, whatever you need." I folded Tova's fingers over the sack. "The North remembers." Tova looked at me for a second. Then she stowed the sack inside her cloak without ceremony. "We leave at dawn," I said. "Figured as much." Tova crossed her arms. "Ride safe." Fjorn extended his hand. I gripped his forearm, the firm hold of men who have no need for more words. Nella waited a few paces from the main fire. Her arms hugged her chest tightly, and her eyes swept our line the moment the horses entered the camp. When I dismounted, she let out her breath all at once. Thick white mist slipped through her cracked lips. "Thank the gods," Nella said, letting the tension in her shoulders yield for a fraction of a second. "We were starting to think the ice had swallowed you. The delay was too long." I stopped near the fire and held my hands over the flames. The heat tingled in my numb joints. "We had to clear the road," I answered, turning my palms to the fire. "Everyone is standing." Fenrir and Hela emerged from the snow before I finished the sentence. The two slipped through the horses and stopped at my feet. Fenrir sat on the packed dirt, his red eyes sweeping the village with the attention of someone mapping new territory. Hela brushed her flank against my lined boot, stepped half a pace away, and licked her own paw, ignoring the rest. Nella narrowed her eyes at the animals. Her gaze quickly shot back to the horses behind me, scanning the line. The crease in her forehead deepened when she didn't find what she was looking for. "Where is Astrid?" she asked, her voice rising half a pitch. "She is well," I said, rubbing the back of my hands. "Stayed with Sigurd on a mission further north. They are together." Nella went quiet for a second. Her mouth tightened. She uncrossed her arms and pointed her chin toward the ground. "And these two?" Fenrir raised his head toward her. His red irises blinked slowly in the fire's reflection. "Fenrir," I said, indicating the wolf with a nod. "And Hela." The cat had seated herself on the tip of my boot and looked at Nella with the expression of someone who hadn't yet decided if the woman deserved attention. Nella assessed the wolf for a long moment. Then she crouched slowly and extended the back of her hand. Fenrir stretched his neck and sniffed her skin. His wet snout touched her fingers for a second, and he pulled back, returning to his seated position. "Where did you find them?" she asked, withdrawing her hand. "They found me," I answered. Nella stared at Fenrir for another instant. Then she stood, her spine straightening and her face closing again. "Right." She pressed her lips together. Stepping away from the fire, I told Nella, "We leave at dawn. Tell the women to gather their belongings and prepare. We march for the wall." Nella turned her back without replying and walked toward the houses. On the other side of the fire, Belzakar, Morgause, Perseus, and Kevin were clustered together. Kevin swung a wooden mug in his hands as he spoke, the liquid nearly spilling into the snow with every movement. Perseus listened with crossed arms and the expression of someone who already knows how the story ends. Morgause and Belzakar kept their backs straight, their tactical posture unchanged even while resting. I approached the circle. They made room without stopping their conversation. We march at dawn, I announced, stopping beside Morgause. Prepare the horses and supplies today. About time, Morgause said. He emptied the mug in a single gulp and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Any plan besides crossing the wall, or is it a surprise? Kevin asked. He lowered his cup and raised an eyebrow, a cynical smile threatening to appear. Tomorrow, I answered, already turning my back to the fire. I'm going to sleep. Kevin opened his mouth to retort. Perseus placed a heavy hand on the archer's shoulder before any sound came out. I walked to the nearest hut and pushed the leather flap open. Fenrir followed uncalled and lay on the packed earth floor, crossing his paws at the entrance. Hela was already curled up in the middle of the straw pallet when I leaned over it. I closed my eyes. The journey consumed an entire week. The 50 women and children of Craster advanced with the dragging slowness of short steps, bearing heavy burdens and their own exhausted lives on their backs. The wall appeared on the horizon, dominating the leaden sky like a scar of white, eternal ice tearing through the world, watching our total insignificance in the vastness. On the third night, we made camp beneath the twisted branches of frozen sentinel trees. The fire crackled and threw sparks into the dark, illuminating the sharp fear in those women's eyes. I picked up the lute. My fingers scraped the thick strings, and the melody rose from my chest, deep, dragging the echoes of the Elysian fields into the heart of the wasteland. I sang of the fire that refuses death and the roots that sustain the world during the fury of winter. Across the circle, a child's crying lost its strength until it faded completely, while Nella let her breath out slowly and rested her head against a fallen trunk. The sound of the strings swallowed the clearing. On the seventh day, the wall swallowed the horizon, a colossal wall of ice blocking the world. From the north side, no castle was visible. The wind battered the ancient structure and whistled back toward the dead forest. There's no gate here, Perseus said, squinting against the glare of the ice. How are we going to cross? Through the dark, I answered. I guided Sleipnir to a natural fissure at the base of the wall, half covered by accumulated snow. We dismounted and entered. The ice tunnel was wide enough for the horses to pass, and the walls echoed the sound of our footsteps. The air inside smelled of an ancient cold that had never seen the sunlight. The darkness swallowed us whole. At the end of the passage, the black gate blocked the way, a colossal face of pale weirwood that seemed to grow from the ice itself, the wrinkled wood forming deep furrows around closed eyes. Who are you? The deep voice tore through the wood and trembled the ground beneath our boots. I drew the dragonbone dagger. I made a quick cut across my left palm and watched the hot blood run down my skin. I pressed my open hand against the pale lips of the tree, letting the true tongue rise through my throat. I am the ice and I am the fire. The black gate opened its white eyes. The milky glow illuminated the ice tunnel. The mouth cracked open with immense force, the wood expanding until it formed a cavernous, damp archway. We passed through the throat of the tree. The freezing air of the tunnel gave way to the smell of old earth and wet stone. We emerged at the base of a long, wide stone ramp carved into the castle's foundations, now on the south side of the wall. We ascended the sloping tunnel one by one, the horses' hooves slipping slightly on the dark moss and scraping against loose stone. The smell of mold thickened with every yard we left behind in the darkness. We reached the top and stepped out into the abandoned kitchens. The black stone carcass of the night fort finally received us. Gray light leaked through a destroyed dome in the ceiling, illuminating the crumbled towers and cracked walls that rose like forgotten tombs. In the center of the shattered hall, a massive weirwood broke through the stone floor, extending thick, white branches like crooked fingers reaching for the air. That tree's mouth was uglier than a giant with a toothache, Perseus said, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Kevin let out a raspy laugh that echoed loudly through the rotting ceiling beams. Belzacar, Morgause, Perseus. Check the entire fort. I want to know if there is anyone else breathing within these walls. The three scattered through the dark corridors. Fenrir sat near the weirwood's roots, his red eyes sweeping the hall. Hela disappeared among the rusted iron cauldrons. Half an hour passed. Then they returned, one by one. Empty, Morgause said. Only dust and wind. All clear, Perseus confirmed. Not necessarily. Kevin looked up at the dark corners of the ceiling. Whatever trapped souls are here are no joke. They say the dead never left the cellars. A few children near Nella shrank back toward their mothers. Nella shot Kevin a look that required no words. Take the women to rest, I said. Some of the dormitories are in fair condition, Belzacar said. I'll take them. While the group left the hall, I approached a dust-covered stone table. I pulled out a piece of parchment and wrote a short note to Castle Black. I called Moonin and secured the letter in his claws. Castle Black, my friend. The raven gave my finger a light peck. He cawed. Beating his wings, he vanished through the open dome. What's the next step? Perseus approached. Do we head back to Winterfell? Belzacar and Morgause will take the women to the winter town. My father will organize housing for them. And us? Kevin asked. We're going hunting, I answered with a smile. Hunting what? The gleam in Kevin's eyes appeared before the question was finished. Bandits, rapists, slavers, ironborn. I folded the remaining parchment. We need a reputation. Without it, the other plans won't move forward. Banditry has risen quite a bit in recent years, Perseus said. I need to contact Eldrick, find out what he knows about the region. I put the parchment away. Go rest, I'll take the watch. Standing guard in this place has its own charm, Kevin said with a short laugh. The others chuckled quietly. The tension left the hall along with them. Fenrir and Hela were already curled up near the fireplace Kevin had lit before leaving. The fire crackled. The shadows on the stone walls were long and still. I sat in a heavy chair and began to write to my father. I reported what had happened north of the wall, omitting what didn't need to arrive by letter. I told him I was well, that the symbol of House Stark had returned with me. I mentioned Fenrir and Hela. I asked after my siblings and requested news about Moat Cailin and Sea Dragon Point. I sealed the letter with wax and called Hugin. The raven landed on the arm of the chair, looked at me with yellow eyes for a second, took the letter, and departed through the broken dome. The sky outside was black. The night fort fell silent. Chapter 31 Night Fort, 278 AC. The previous night's fire turned to ash under the pale light of dawn. Nella was already on her feet, tying bundles and organizing the women before most had opened their eyes. Near the kitchen hearth, Kevin boiled strips of meat over the embers. The smell of fat and dried herbs spread through the main hall. Perseus entered the castle stomping his boots, his shoulders and bearskin covered by a thick layer of fresh snow. I chewed on a tough piece of meat, watching Nella. Tension marked the posture of her shoulders. Her fingers squeezed the ropes with unnecessary force. The north of the wall was the only home those women knew, and even though Craster was a wretched bastard, his roof offered a corrupted form of security. The south was a blind territory, inhabited by men who considered the free folk mortal enemies. I stood and walked over to her. I stopped by her side. She let go of the rope and rubbed her hands to ward off the cold. I held her hands between mine. Rest easy, I said, looking straight into her eyes. Follow the laws of men and the old gods, listen to my father's counsel, and work hard. Nothing will happen to you. From the moment I brought you all with me, you are under my protection. She closed her eyes. Her trembling breath escaped through her nose, condensing in the freezing air. Nella nodded. Thank you for everything. We never thanked you properly, she said, her voice coming out hoarse as her fingers squeezed mine back. On behalf of all of us, we thank you and your friends for saving us from that monster and giving the children a future. Just not being north of the wall is already a relief. A quick, unpracticed smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. I nodded and returned the smile. Belzacar and Morgause will go with you to Winterfell, I said quieter, slowly releasing her hands. My father is already aware. When you arrive, he will find a place for all of you to stay while things are sorted out. Nella agreed with a nod. There were no more questions to ask. I stepped away and went to Morgause. He was adjusting the leather straps of a pack saddle with the concentration of a man who prefers work over talk. I placed a folded paper in his hand. When you reach Winterfell, buy these items, I instructed, folding his dark fingers over the paper. Tell the blacksmith to follow the instructions to the letter. Return to the night fort when you're done. I believe we will still be here, otherwise, I will send word. Morgause nodded and extended his forearm. The grip was dry and rigid. He tucked the paper inside his jacket without replying. Be careful on the road, I said, turning away. Belzacar was a few steps ahead, finishing the knot on the last horse's baggage. I approached and gripped his arm. Take care of them, I ordered. Always, he answered, without taking his eyes off the rope. I stood near the central well of the night fort. The women and children formed a long, slow line between the two spearmen. The column moved toward the southern trail, slowly shrinking against the white vastness. The last silhouette disappeared among the dead pines, and the wind reclaimed the courtyard. Fenrir sat by my side until the end. When I turned on my heels to go inside, he followed me. I found Kevin and Perseus near the ruined stables. We'll stay here for a few days, I announced, stopping before them. We need meat. Hunt. Kevin looked up at the broken towers of the Nightfort with the expression of a man weighing a bad bet. You know this place is cursed, right? Hunt. I repeated, keeping my voice flat and leaving no room for debate. Kevin snorted and walked off. He and Perseus mounted up and rode through the gates. I was left alone with Fenrir and Hela. Hard to imagine this was once the main castle of the Night's Watch. It's more like a castle out of Bram Stoker's books than anything else. The quality of the silence in the cellars was oppressive. The footsteps echoed wrongly, distorted by the cracked vaults. The fire Kevin had lit in the main hall burned in the center, but the heat failed to reach the stone walls. Fenrir stopped dead in front of certain subterranean passages. The wolf flattened his ears against his skull, the fur on his nape bristling, and refused to take a single step into the dark. For the entire first week, I studied the wall. The fissure was located in a stretch of the northern wall, in an isolated section. The ice there had an opaque hue. The floor markings weren't in the exact spot I had seen in the cave vision. Time had shifted everything a few meters, changed the angles, and swallowed the contours beneath accumulated ice, but the anomaly was rooted in the same general area. Touching the structure barehanded was a mistake I only made once. The cold pierced my skin before any muscular reflex could make me pull back. A dense, pulsating cold, rhythmic like the slow breathing of a sick beast. The smell hit my face a second later. A stench heavy with miasma, the same putrid exhalation of necromancy, the invasive texture of watching a corpse being devoured by maggots. My stomach churned, forcing an acidic taste to the base of my throat. I pulled my hand back. I stared at my purpling fingers for a moment. The exposed fissure was minimal. A diagonal crack perhaps a handspan wide between two massive foundation blocks. The original builders had sealed the gap with ancient runes, but the corrosive moisture had reduced the symbols to mere faded sketches. What escaped from it was invisible, a pressure that swelled and receded. Something on the other side was pushing against the boundary. I brought my face closer to the stone to gauge the depth of the crack. A woman was watching through the opening. Her skin was white as dead snow, smooth and devoid of any color. Her eyes shone with the deep blue of the ancient ice buried beneath the wall. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. They merely stared at me through the small fissure, silent and empty. She was millimeters from the ice, waiting on the other side of the wall. Waiting. The air grew thick in the cellar, weighing heavily on my lungs. The cold increased brutally around the block, stinging the bones in my face. A rasping, measured sound leaked from within, the wet friction of a drawn breath. The woman smiled. The urge to vomit surged up my throat violently. I scrambled back roughly, my boots slipping on the wet stone. I slammed my back against the tunnel wall, my chest pulling in air with force while my fingers gripped the hilt of the Valyrian steel dagger. The fissure was still there. Just a black crack. I examined the faded runes over the following days, scraping the surface frost without ever bringing my face near the ice again. The blocks still bore the scars of the original carvings. The grooves in the stone revealed the logic. The original seal had been laid in 3 layers, the first structural, binding the stone, the second exclusionary, preventing passage, the third anchoring, using blood to lock the first 2 in place. The third had failed. Without the blood sustaining it, the other 2 had slowly given way, like a tent without pegs. Damned necromancy. On the 7th day, I heard footsteps behind me. Too light to be Kevin or Perseus. Any discoveries, young one? Asked a familiar voice. I spun on my heels. Leaf stood 10 feet away. Her hands were hidden inside her cloak. Her golden eyes reflected the gray of the stone. Behind her, Ash kept her body weight leaning on a staff, motionless and silent. How long have you been here? I asked, facing the child of the forest. Long enough. Leaf stepped closer slowly, her eyes scanning the blocks, the worn runes, the diagonal crack. You found the problem. I found the problem 6 days ago, I replied, pointing a finger along a rune line without touching the ice. I spent the other 5 figuring out why the obvious solution wouldn't work. And, she prompted, blinking slowly. The original seal used blood as an anchor. Without it, nothing holds. I can clean the corrupted runes and rewrite the layers on the clean stone, but without the anchor, the work will unravel before it's finished. Blood acts as mortar for the spell. I turned my face to her. If we clean the stone, rewrite the 3 layers, and seal it with blood, the fissure closes. Leaf remained quiet for a long moment. The price, she said, her voice sounding deeper. I know the price, I affirmed, keeping my arms steady at my sides. Then you know common blood does not anchor what was built here. The golden eyes didn't blink. To hold the third layer, it requires the blood of kings. Then we don't have a problem, I replied immediately. You told me yourselves I carry the blood of 3 lineages. I crossed my arms. Silence descended upon the cellar. The magic here is ancient and wild, Leaf warned, taking a short step forward. My ancestors and yours forged it millennia ago. Magic is a blade without a hilt. The price might be too high even for your blood. You could die. The fissure is small. The work will exhaust me, but it won't kill me. I looked back at the crack in the black ice. The miasma leaking from here is enough to corrupt everything within a radius of days of marching. Someone has to do it. Leaf stood still for another moment. Then she pulled her hands from her cloak. The obsidian dagger appeared tucked into her belt. Sealing the fissure won't clear the air immediately, Leaf said in a raspy voice. The miasma will require time to dissipate completely. I thought the same thing. That's why I've been working on a plan, I explained, pointing to the dark roots in the ceiling. When water gets contaminated, we filter it through sand, charcoal, and stone. Each layer removes part of the corruption until something pure remains. The heart trees do the same. The roots drink from the earth. The faces watch. The wood absorbs memories, blood, pain, and magic. If planted in the right spots, connected by the deep ancient lines beneath the north, they can act as filters. Leaf frowned. Filters? She asked, the word sounding foreign in her mouth. With the fissure sealed, the miasma would stagnate in the air, but the heart trees would suck it in, filtering the rot. The climate won't change overnight, but it will be fast enough to normalize in the coming years. An interesting theory. Perhaps it will work, but to carve the faces, you will need my help. Leaf murmured something low to Ash in the true tongue, then turned her eyes back to me. We will help you, as we promised. Her tone became practical again. Furthermore, I will divide the price of the fissure with you. My blood added to yours will reduce the exhaustion. The work will remain within what we both can endure. You don't need to do that, I said, watching her hand rest near the dagger. I know. Leaf tucked her hands back into her cloak of pinned leaves. When do we begin? It took another day of preparation. Ash cleaned the blocks with a mixture of ash and weirwood sap, dissolving the accumulated ice and the wear of centuries, layer by layer. The original stone beneath the grime reappeared. The corrupted runes were scraped away with precision, preserving the outline to guide the spell. When the surface was clean, we began to write. Leaf dictated in the true tongue, and I traced. The first layer bound the intention to the block. The second, exclusionary, built in 3 passes over the first. The third remained empty, waiting. I looked at Leaf. She already gripped the obsidian. I closed my hand around the blade of the Valyrian steel dagger and pulled. The cut was quick and clean across my left palm. Leaf slid the obsidian across the 4 fingers of her own hand, opening a dry, precise gash. We began to recite. The true tongue sounded distorted in the vaulted cellars of the night fort. The words struck the stones and returned slightly altered, as if the wall were answering. We ran our warm blood through the grooves of the third layer together. The movement was slow and deliberate, following the angle of each rune without interrupting the chant. The stone drank the blood. The ice around the fissure began to melt, water running down the rune channels as if following an ancient riverbed. The crack narrowed further. Then it closed. The 2 massive blocks settled against each other with a low thud that came from the bottom of the foundation. I stood still, breathing loudly. Exhaustion pulled at the muscles in my legs, but I didn't buckle my knees. I extended my left hand and pressed my clean fingers against the wall. Only cold. The stone was cold the way stone should be cold. The macabre breathing had stopped. The miasma pouring through the fissure vanished. Only ice, silence, and the ancient weight of the wall operating as it should remain. Looks like it worked, I told Leaf, panting. Yes. She stepped closer and pressed the palm of her 4 fingers against the block. She stood like that for a moment. Then she withdrew her hand. Yes. A caw echoed from the floor above. I looked up. Atop a rotting wooden beam that still held near the stairs, a massive raven was perched. Its feathers bore a metallic sheen. It possessed 3 eyes, the middle one red and quiet as an ember. I held its gaze. The vapor of my breath rose in the freezing air. Brynden, I said low, without taking my eyes off the bird. Looks like we did it. The raven tilted its head. It evaluated the closed fissure with its red eye. It flapped its broad wings and vanished into the shadows of the ruins above. The fissure is sealed. What is the next step? Leaf asked, wiping the obsidian blade. I'll finish the rune diagram we'll use for the filters, I replied, adjusting my gloves over my aching hands. In the meantime, do what must be done. Leaf nodded. Ash and I will head south, she concluded, turning her back. There are faces that need to be carved into the weirwoods. More than a moon passed. Time at the night fort crawled, marked only by the creeping frost on the walls and the progress of my studies. I had finished the rune diagrams, copying the exact matrices onto leather parchments. The fissure remained closed. The pulsation of the miasma had vanished completely. The sound of hooves breaking the snow crust in the courtyard cut through the afternoon silence. I walked to the kitchen exit. Morgause and Belzacar rode through the ruined gates. The horses' flanks were caked in a thick layer of frozen sweat. The group arrived safely, Belzacar said, dismounting and tying the reins to the post. Lord Stark granted space in the winter town. He provided some work in the castle and the rest in the village. Morgause walked to the packhorse and untied a small wooden box, reinforced with iron corners. He handed it to me. The blacksmith in Winterfell cursed for 3 days, Morgause said, shaking his head. He told me that if I wanted to use a blade this small, I should have ordered a sewing needle. I opened the wooden lid. Inside lay a scalpel forged from polished steel, forceps, a sort of silver hook, and some silk threads. Thank you, Morgause, I said, and snapped the latch shut. Kevin emerged from the dark corridor carrying his weirwood bow. Does this mean we're leaving? He looked up at the black stone ceiling. I started hearing footsteps on the upper floors last night. My patience for hunting ghosts has run out. At dawn, I ordered, tucking the box under my arm. Belzacar and Morgause need to rest from the road. Tomorrow we ride for Castle Black. The night fort was left behind with the sunrise. Chapter 32 Surgery. Castle Black, 278 AC. The journey east was swift, with no long stops. Without Craster's caravan, the horses set an aggressive pace over the hard-packed snow. 2 days later, the timber and stone structure of Castle Black appeared against the colossal wall of ice. We entered the main courtyard at a slow walk. The clatter of horseshoes on stone drew the attention of the guards on watch. A dozen men stopped what they were doing, their eyes fixed on our formation, on the dark skin of Belzacar and Morgause, and on the sheer size of Fenrir and Hela, who were already growing rapidly alongside my mount. 3 rangers with spears blocked the path near the stables. Arthur Snow, I called out, dismounting from Sleipnir. I am here to see the Lord Commander. The guards hesitated for a second, eyeing the giant wolf, but stepped aside. One of them jogged ahead to alert the command. Corgyle met us at the base of the main staircase, his hands resting on his belt and his face etched with deep wrinkles tight against the cold. He assessed the entire group before locking eyes with me. Arthur Snow, Corgyle greeted, his voice rough. What brings you and these beasts back to my yard? The work I set out to do in the forest is done, I replied, stopping before the step. I am only passing through. Has the caravan I dispatched from Winterfell arrived? The tension in the Lord Commander's shoulders eased a fraction. It arrived before the last new moon, Corgyle answered, dropping his hands from his belt. The steel, the gold, and the armor are already in our armories. The food filled the old cellar. And the rangers are emptying your barrels of icefire and frost spirit faster than I'd like to admit. The intention was exactly to keep the blood warm, I said, resting my hands on my belt. And how did you cross to this side of the wall on your return? Corgyle pointed his chin toward the south gate, his dark eyes narrowing beneath thick brows. I received no raven from Eastwatch about your party. Nor did I see you scale the ice. The north is vast and keeps old paths, Lord Commander. I maintained a neutral tone and a direct gaze. I am only here to fulfill a promise I made to Maester Emmon before marching. Where is he? Corgyle stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight at the evasion. Then he gestured toward the rookery tower with his hand. In his chambers. As always, Emmon's chambers smelled of old parchment, melted wax, and bitter herbs. The old maester sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, his bony hands resting on his knees. His milky, blind eyes stared at the fire. The wind coming through the crack has shifted, Emmon said, his frail voice dragging through the quiet room. Who is there? I promised I would return, Maester. I placed the wooden box on the reading desk. The dull thud made Emmon turn his face in my direction. I brought the instruments. Emmon extended a trembling hand and felt the air until he found the edge of the desk. My eyes died many years ago, boy. The darkness has already settled. His fingertips touched the closed wood. The darkness is only on the surface, Maester. It is an opaque fabric over the eye's natural lens. I unlatched the metal lock. The gleam of silver caught the firelight. The glass lenses and the tools have arrived. I am going to give you your light back. The old Maester fell silent. The crackling of wood turning to embers was the only sound in the room. Many men with heavy Maester's chains around their necks studied blindness at the citadel, Emin said. None of them spoke of cutting the eye of a living man. I don't wear the citadel's chains, I replied, lifting the scalpel from the box. I will have water boiled and milk of the poppy prepared. We do this at first light. What will you need? Asked Emin, drawing his hands back to his lap. I have most of the items already, I said, setting the silk thread next to the forceps. I only require a clean room and access to your herbal stock. There is an adjacent room where I treat the wounded. Emin pointed weakly toward the side door. You may use it, my entire stock is yours. I will begin the preparations, I announced, picking the box back up. Rest. Tomorrow, you will see again. I went to the next room. I scrubbed away as much dirt as I could, hauled up a barrel of frost spirit from our stock, and rubbed the pure alcohol across the floor, the nearby walls, and the cot where Emin would lie. The caustic smell flooded the floor. I finished hours later and went to sleep. On the way, I found Kevin teaching shooting stances to some raw recruits in the yard. Kevin, I called. He lowered his bow and walked toward me. I'm going to need your help tomorrow. I'll be operating on the Maester and I need another pair of steady hands to assist. You have the best stability in the group. I'm in, Kevin replied, a crooked smile forming on his dirty face. It's not every day you get to see someone perform a surgery. Get some rest. We start with the first rays of the sun. The sun had barely risen when I entered the room. The air was thick with the strong smell of frost spirit, alcohol, and lamp smoke. The wall's freezing temperature helped suppress any rot in the air, but I still took a vodka-soaked rag and wiped down the side table, the reinforced chair, and the metal instruments one last time. The blades gleamed under the yellow light. Small, thin. The door creaked behind me. Kevin walked in, adjusting his leather gloves. His eyes swept the table and locked onto the tiny scalpel. 7 hells, the archer muttered. You're actually going to cut his eye. I'm going to make a minimal incision in the cornea, I corrected, dipping the forceps into the alcohol. If my hand slips a millimeter, he'll never see anything again. Kevin blew air out of his nose. Great way to start the morning. Shortly after, Clytus helped Maester Emin into the room. The old man walked slowly, tapping the floor with his wooden cane. It smells like a tavern floor in here, Emin grumbled, wrinkling his nose. Better a tavern than an infection, I said, pulling the reinforced chair into the center of the light. Clytus seated the old man in the chair. I secured 2 thick leather straps behind his head and across his chest, locking them to the wood. Are you truly going to tie me down? Emin asked, his fingers gripping the armrests with sudden force. I intend to return your vision, not let a flinch drive your face into my blade, I replied, buckling the last strap. Kevin cleared his throat quietly behind me. I took a clean cloth and soaked it in frost spirit. I wiped Emin's face with quick strokes, focusing around the eyelids. The old man gritted his teeth. Does it burn? I asked, pressing near his eyebrow. Like fire, he hissed. Perfect. I handed another soaked rag to Kevin. Scrub your hands, between the fingers and up the wrists. Kevin stared at the cloth reeking of hard liquor. You really believe wasting good alcohol like this works? Yes, I affirmed. He didn't argue. We scrubbed our hands until the skin pulled tight from dryness. I picked up a small cup of warm wine mixed with milk of the poppy. Drink, I ordered, pressing the rim against his lips. Emin swallowed the bitter liquid in one go. We waited for his shoulders to sag and his breathing to level out. His chest rose and fell heavily. I pulled the needles from the box. Kevin raised an eyebrow. In those? Muscle relaxation, I answered, separating the finest metal. I pressed my fingers against Emin's slack neck, found the rigid points, and inserted the first needle beneath his jaw. The Maester let out a long sigh. The second went behind his ear. The third near his wrist. I twisted the metal carefully. The old man's body went completely limp against the leather straps. Is he out? Kevin whispered, leaning forward. His body stopped fighting the pain. His mind is still there. Clytus watched from the corner of the room, his face pale. He swallowed hard, nodded, and hurried out, closing the door behind him. I picked up the scalpel. I passed the blade over the lamp's flame for 2 seconds and wiped it with alcohol. Raise the light, I instructed Kevin, positioning myself in front of the patient. When I tell you, lock his skull with both hands. The archer nodded. The irony vanished from his face. The yellow light hit Emin's left eye head-on, reflecting off the thick, white cataract. Hold, I warned. Kevin's hands clamped down on the sides of the maester's face with the strength of stone. I took a deep breath, forced the air out, and held it. The tip of the steel touched the cornea. I made a tiny lateral incision. A minuscule bead of fluid leaked from the corner of the eye. I wiped it instantly with the sterile cloth. Emin let out a hollow groan from the back of his throat, his fingers squeezing the chair's wood until his knuckles turned white. Steady, I murmured to Kevin, steadying my hand. I swapped the scalpel for the silver hook. The curved instrument entered through the tiny slit. The opaque lens looked like a disk of milky ice blocking the pupil. The goal was to push it down, couching the cataract into the vitreous chamber, out of the line of sight. Kevin held the lamp completely paralyzed. I felt the mechanical resistance of the hardened tissue. I pressed slowly. Sweat stung the corner of my eye, but I didn't blink. The film yielded. The white fog slipped toward the bottom of the eye, revealing the dark, unobstructed pupil behind it. I withdrew the hook with care. I let the air out through my nose. I picked up the metal syringe and irrigated the incision with cold, boiled water mixed with diluted frost spirit. The left eye was red and swollen, but the milky white was gone. Did you get it? Kevin asked, his voice sounding a pitch higher than normal. The obstacle dropped, I answered, wiping the old man's eyelids with cotton. He'll see light and shapes again. Now let's do the right one. I repeated the process on the other eye. Emin's right eye offered more resistance. The cataract was wedged deeper. I forced the hook with extreme care while the old man moaned under the effect of the poppy. Kevin pressed harder against the skull, gripping the wood. I felt the film finally give way and the fog slide out of the center of vision. I let my breath out slowly. I took the boiled silk thread and the finest needle. I closed the 2 incisions. Stitch by stitch, minuscule and precise. Emin barely reacted now, buried deep in the exhaustion of pain. I wiped away the residual blood and tied a clean cotton bandage around the maester's head, covering both eyes. I stepped back from the chair. The relief released the tension in my shoulders. My hands were stiff and my back ached. Kevin slowly let go of Emin's head and lowered the lamp. 7 hells, he breathed, rubbing his own face. I thought you were going to tear his eye out at one point. The surgery was the manual part. Now we need to make sure he doesn't die of infection. I paused, putting away the dirty metal. And then I'll need to finish the glasses. The recovery exacted its toll. Operating on both eyes in the same session had left the maester's aged body exhausted and drained. During the first 7 days, Emin remained plunged in darkness beneath the bandages of boiled cotton. I isolated the infirmary room from the rest of Castle Black. I nailed thick woolen cloths over the window cracks, blocking the biting wind and the white light of day. The oak door remained locked from the inside. The caustic smell of frost spirit permeated the wood and stone of the room. 3 times a day, I boiled water, dried my hands and wrists in pure alcohol, and swapped the bandages. The process required scraping the dry secretion built up on his eyelashes and checking the tiny dark stitches on the cornea. Swelling and redness took over the sagging skin of his face. I feel as if live coals were shoved beneath my eyelids, the old maester murmured, his voice trembling with exhaustion, while I ran the wet linen over him. Excellent, I replied, without stopping the movement of my fingers over his face. It means the tissue is alive and reacting. Kevin dragged a bench into the corridor on the other side of the door. The weirwood bow rested on his lap the entire time. If anyone with muddy boots sneezes in this hallway, he's going to lose a leg, Kevin said, extending his arm to block the path of Clytus and a young steward who tried to bring firewood. On the 3rd day, Emin's right eye swelled to double its size. A strong line of heat radiated up the old man's temple. I irrigated the cornea all through the night, dripping continuous drops of cold water with extremely diluted alcohol and willow bark extract. I sat on the wooden bench, my back to the dead hearth, rubbing ice on my own neck to force my eyes to stay open. The rigid swelling on Emin's face receded just before dawn. The fever broke. The 7th night marked the removal of the bandages. The room was steeped in a heavy silence. The dry firewood crackled low in the hearth. Kevin leaned his shoulder against the cold stone beside the doorframe, his arms crossed and his tongue locked. I stopped beside the cot. Emin sat with his back straight against the wooden headboard. His bony hands gripped the wool of the blanket. The swelling has subsided, I announced, standing before him. Emin let out a rasping laugh. I haven't seen beyond my eyelids for decades, boy. Just do it. I untied the cotton knot at the base of his nape. The bandage fell onto his lap. Emin locked his jaw, keeping his eyelids clamped tightly together. I picked up the silver-rimmed glasses I had hammered myself in the forge. I fitted the structure over his prominent nose and hooked the arms behind his pale ears. The thick lenses settled in front of his swollen face. Open them slowly. The light will strike hard. The sparse, purplish eyelids rose by millimeters. The yellow light of the fire invaded the black pupils. Emin jerked his neck backward with a jolt, shrinking his shoulders. Blink, I ordered. He obeyed. The accumulated water ran down the corners of his face. His eyeballs moved in their sockets, groping the blurry space and seeking the metrics of the room. The old maester's body froze. The flames of the hearth reflected in the curvature of the tempered glass. Emin turned his face directly toward the fire. The pupils dilated as they captured the flare crackling on the logs and the orange glow staining the chimney soot. The old man's breathing lost its rhythm. His chest rose and fell with unexpected violence. Thick tears overflowed, washing the burst vessels in the white background of the eye and running down the silver frame. He raised his right hand to the level of his nose. The long fingers, twisted by decades and marked by dark spots, trembled loose in the air. Emin stared fixedly at his own nails. A choked wheeze burst from his throat. His face turned toward me. The glass lenses focused on my posture, my dark cloak, and the hard line carved into my face. Egg, Emin murmured. Tears cut through the furrows of his cheeks uncontrollably. I thought I saw my brother. I stood still, keeping my hands at my sides, while that man's vision settled into the present time. Emin wiped his nose with the back of his hand and diverted his moist eyes to the corner. He focused on Kevin leaning against the stone wall. And you must be Kevin, Emin said. A crooked smile made room for the first time among the wrinkles on his face. You are uglier than your words suggested. Kevin threw his head back with a loud laugh, pushing his weight off the wall and stomping his boot against the wooden floor. The laughter echoed against the ceiling, but the old maester's hands did not stop trembling. He turned his neck slowly, his reddened, magnified eyes behind the silver rims mapping the dark ceiling beams, the scratched floorboards, and the thin smoke rising through the stone chimney. Chapter 33 Wolfpack, Part 1. Chapter 2, Part 1. Castle Black, 278 AC. The courtyard of Castle Black smelled of sweat and wet sawdust. Steel rang against steel and the metallic echo bounced off the dark wooden walls. I stayed 7 more days at the wall. During the afternoons, the group shared the packed earth training yard with Corgyle's rangers. Morgause dropped a recruit with a shaft strike behind the knees. The boy fell facefirst into the trampled snow. The former Unsullied did not change his expression. He simply extended the spear tip to the fallen boy's throat and waited for him to get up. In another corner, Pursued traded heavy blows from his greatsword against 2 veteran rangers, the breath of all 3 turning white smoke in the cold air. The inflammation in Emin's eyes disappeared on the 5th day. The thick redness around the iris receded. The risk of the flesh rotting and the infection reaching the nerve vanished completely. The maester changed his routine. The wooden cane he used to feel his way through the corridors stayed propped in the corner of his room, gathering dust. Emin spent his mornings near the rookery window, his face turned toward the courtyard, following the movement of the carts and the training of the men with eyes magnified by the glass lenses. In the Castle Black library, the candles burned to the base. The sound of dry pages turning filled the dusty air. He read with both hands flat on the table, his nose a handspan from the parchment, his fingers tracing the path of the ink. He smiled to himself at the end of a page, the thin lips curving under the wrinkled skin. On the 8th day, the wooden winch groaned against the colossal wall. The iron cage rose to the top of the wall. The wind up there cut the skin of the face like broken glass. I walked beside Emin on the suspended platform. The old man wore a thick black wool cloak, his shoulders pulled in against the cold. He stopped at the edge and rested both hands on the smooth ice of the parapet. His eyes, protected by the silver frames, looked out over the white vastness of the haunted forest. I had forgotten the color of the pines. Emin's voice competed with the hum of the wind. Memory paints everything with a gray crust after too many years. I stood beside him, looking north. Fenrir lay near my boots, ears alert to the empty space. The swelling is gone, I said, adjusting the collar of my coat. The corneal wound has sealed. You are out of danger. Emin did not turn his face from the forest. A blind man near the end of his life usually just sits and accepts the dark, he said, pulling the frozen air in hard. His chest filled under the heavy wool. You tore the darkness from me, Arthur. You gave back the words of my books and the shape of the clouds. The wind whipped the hem of his cloak, scattering a cloud of ice dust across the platform. My brother Aegon sent me here with an honor guard, long ago, Aemon continued. His bony fingers tightened on the ice edge. He emptied the dungeons of King's Landing to escort me. Sir Duncan the Tall rode at my side down the King's Road. I chose the wall so that my blood would never be used as a weapon against him on the throne. Aemon turned his face in my direction. The reflection of the snow shone in the curved surface of the lenses. Royal blood is an anchor that drags you to the bottom, boy. The north takes its price in ice, and the south takes its in fire, the old maester said, his voice dropping. You carry the wolf on your chest, but I did not need my eyes to notice your nature. I felt the complete absence of tremor in your hand when the blade cut my flesh, and I know the methodical patience you used to shape this glass alone in the small hours. Aemon raised his right hand and touched the silver frames of his own spectacles. Men who act with such coldness and precision tend to burn the bridges they cross, certain they will never need to return, he said. The gaze behind the lens was sharp, stripped of the fog of age. Build roads, Arthur. Winter is not survived alone. The wind howled harder, carrying the sound away. I did not answer. I turned my eyes back to the white sea beyond the end of the world, while the ice cracked under the weight of the wall. The smell of bitter herbs and melted wax still filled the rooms in the rookery tower. I closed the metal clasp of the surgery case with a dry snap and ran the leather strap over the top. Aemon was seated in the high-backed chair. An open parchment with logistics notes rested in his lap, but his restored eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, followed the steady movement of my hands securing the equipment. My men are at the stables with the horses saddled in the courtyard, I said, throwing the weight of the dark wool cloak over my shoulders. I'm leaving for the south. The old maester set his bony hands on the wooden arms of the chair and rose slowly. His knees cracked with the effort of his age. He took a short step, dragging his boot across the plank floor, and stopped in front of me. The firelight reflected in the silver frames. Aemon studied the cut of my jaw, the scar, and the dark scabbard of the Valyrian blade at my hip with a focus that had previously been impossible for him. I have spent most of my life advising men to forget the families, the crowns, and the kingdoms they left behind, Aemon said. His breath wheezed faint in the wrinkled throat. You are the first I advise to go back to them. Keep the lenses clean with the silk cloth, I said, lifting the wooden case and tucking it under my arm. And avoid straining to read when the fire is dying. The glass demands light or it exhausts the eye muscles. Aemon extended his right hand. The fingers were long, bent by decades, marked with age spots. I took his hand. The rough skin felt like thin paper stretched over dry bones. The grip lacked physical strength but held the rigid firmness of someone who knew exactly what they were holding. The ice of the wall preserves, the maester murmured, releasing my fingers and drawing his arm back toward his body. May the old gods preserve you, Arthur Snow. I nodded once. I turned on my heels and went out through the heavy oak door. Glancing over my shoulder before pulling the latch shut, I saw the maester standing in the center of the room, following my steps in complete silence with his own sight. The wooden winch descended creaking to the ice base. The iron cage struck the hard ground with a dull thud, lifting a cloud of fine snow. I unlatched the grate and walked into the courtyard. Kevin, Pursue, Belzacar, and Morgause were waiting near the stables with the horses already saddled. The animal's breath formed thick clouds in the morning air. I adjusted the buckles of Sleipnir's saddle and secured the saddlebag. What do we do now? Kevin asked, settling the weirwood bow on his shoulder and knocking his boots together to clear the snow. I pulled the reins and mounted. One thing left, I answered, turning the horse south. We left Castle Black under the gray sky. After a few hours of riding through the broken terrain of the Gift, the line of pines opened into an isolated clearing. At its exact center stood a massive weirwood. The bark was white as old bone and the blood-red leaves shone against the frost. Leaf and ash were crouched at the base of the tree. An obsidian dagger scraped against the white wood, carving the deep lines of a smooth face. Red shavings fell into the snow. Leaf, ash, I said, dismounting from Sleipnir. The child of the forest stopped the movement of her arm and turned her small face in my direction. Oh, you took your time, Leaf said, dusting the white powder from her hands. We are already on the last one. Ash murmured a series of rough syllables in the true tongue, the sound imitating the crack of dry branches. The structure of the sentence translated in my mind. I let out a low laugh, matched by Leaf's sharp smile. Kevin, Pursue, Belzakar, and Morgaz exchanged heavy looks, eyebrows drawn together, shifting their weight from one leg to the other in complete silence. You were right, Leaf agreed with Ash, turning her yellowed eyes back to me. That Dreadfort is a grim place. The air there smells of old blood and rotting stone. It drains the life from anyone who steps near it. Was she seen by anyone? I asked, pulling my heavy leather gloves and tucking them into my belt. You underestimate me, Leaf answered sharply, her jaw tightening and the markings on her skin darkening. Never, I said, I have already carved all the anchoring runes into the other trees. The circuit is ready, Leaf gestured with the dark blade toward the wide trunk. If you want to engrave the matrix into this last weirwood, to say you did something, the space is yours. Right, I agreed. I walked to the back of the white trunk, on the face opposite the carved features. I drew the Valyrian steel dagger and sank the edge into the pale bark. Red sap ran slowly down the shallow cuts as I traced the complex network of angles and straight filtering lines. The work demanded tendon strength and exact repetition. The wind cut through the clearing dozens of times before I finally stepped back and lowered the blade. Done, I said, wiping the cold sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. Finally, come, Leaf called, sheathing the obsidian. I walked around the wide trunk. The face carved into the white wood stared at the clearing with deep eyes and a mouth open in a silent cry. The proportions aligned perfectly with the old gods. Was something supposed to happen? Kevin asked, leaning against the flank of his horse. Technically yes, I answered, walking back to stand before the wooden face. It needs ignition. I stopped a handspan from the bark. I closed my left hand around the sharp edge of my own dagger and pulled. The cut opened across the palm. Dark blood rose immediately. I pressed my bleeding hand against the white cheek of the weirwood, spreading the red across the smooth texture. The words of the true tongue rose through my throat and filled the clearing air with raw clicks and whistles. The sound of the wind disappeared. The breeze froze in the leaves. The clouded sky above vanished, replaced by an absolute opalescent white. My eyes rolled back. A heavy, collective hum took the clearing. Dozens of birds broke from the canopy of the surrounding trees. Ravens, falcons, owls, and birds of prey formed a frantic whirl around the weirwood's branches, beating wings in a noisy chaos. My consciousness was not there to watch the storm of feathers. The mind sank through the network beneath the frozen earth, feeling the pulse of the sap expand and connect from coast to coast of the north, running along the lines of force. The torpor lasted an uncountable number of minutes. When my vision focused again, the clearing was empty of birds and submerged in silence. The thick, reddish sap bubbled and ran from the carved eyelids in the hollow of the weirwood's mouth, staining the white trunk all the way down to the snow-covered ground. The weirwoods are connected, I said, heavy breath coming out in hot jets of steam. Leaf moved to the trunk. She extended her hand and pressed her 3 fingers into the pool of sap running down the wood. You did it, the child of the forest said. She turned and pressed her red-stained palm onto my shoulder. We did it, I replied, squeezing the wound in my palm to stop the bleeding. The silence stretched heavy between the trees. Do you need anything more from us right now? Leaf asked, stepping back and blending into the shadows of the foliage. No, I shook my head. I know you have something you want to do. Go. If I need anything, I will know how to call. Right, she nodded. Take care, you too as well. The silhouettes of Leaf and Ash turned their backs and simply disappeared between the trunks as quickly as the blink of an eye, without a single dry branch breaking under their small feet. I turned and faced the other 4. They stood still near their mounts, watching the thick drops of sap stain the snow. Now we are ready, I said, walking to Sleipnir to take a strip of linen and bind the cut hand. We have a hunt to begin. Chapter 34 Wolfpack, Part 2. Shipbreaker Bay, 278 AC. The sky over the bay was a mass of hail and darkness. The wind howled against the immense circular walls of Storm's End, tearing pieces of tile from the smaller towers and forcing the Black Sea to rise in lethal columns of salt foam. On the upper battlements, Robert gripped the gray stone parapet with both hands. His knuckles stood white with the force. Rainwater ran down his black hair plastered against his broad face, soaking through the drenched doublet. Beside him, Stannis held his posture straight and unreadable. The boy locked his jaw, pressing his eyes against the force of the storm. In the violent water below, the pride of the wind fought the abyss. Lord Stefan Baratheon had sent a letter from Essos days earlier. The parchment reported the failure to find a suitable Valyrian bride for Prince Rhaegar, but announced the purchase of an exceptional court fool, full of tricks and songs, capable of drawing a laugh even from Stannis. The three-masted galley crossed the outer rocks and entered the brothers' line of sight. A wall of seawater, as tall as the secondary towers, lifted the hull of the vessel. The timbers groaned loud, the mainmast snapped, hurling pine splinters into the air. The wave came down with crushing force. The vessel struck sideways against the sharp rocks hidden beneath the foam of the bay. The impact's crash swallowed the thunder in the leaden sky. The hull split from end to end. Cold water swallowed the deck in seconds, dragging Lord Stefan, Lady Cassana, and dozens of sailors against the sharp reefs. The pride of the wind sank into the darkness before the wide eyes of Robert and the frozen expression of Stannis. There was no time for cries of help. 3 days later, the sea returned what remained. Splintered planks, torn cloth, and blue bodies chewed by crabs fouled the wet sand. Near a pile of rotted ropes, a small body coughed. Salt water poured from the mouth along with seaweed. The man rolled face down in the sand. The bald, gaunt skin displayed dozens of red and green square tattoos covering the face and skull down to the nape. The jester's bell hat was crushed, hanging over one torn ear. Patches sat up on the beach, hugging his thin knees. He stared at the murderous sea with hollow eyes. He opened his bruised mouth and started to laugh. The drawn-out, disconnected, raving sound echoed across the empty beach. King's Landing, Red Keep, 278 AC. Grand Maester Pycelle walked with short, shuffling steps through the dark corridors. The dozens of chains at his neck clinked with each loose movement. He carried a parchment stained with salt water, the Baratheon seal crushed flat. The throne room smelled of old wax smoke and mold. Aerys II Targaryen stood before the mountain of rusted swords that formed the Iron Throne. The king paced in small circles, muttering to himself. The thin silver hair fell over his shoulders in dirty knots. His long, yellow, cracked nails scraped the side of his own neck in a continuous motion, peeling flakes of old skin. Your Grace. Pycelle bent his aching back. An urgent raven from Storm's End. Aerys stopped abruptly. The king's wide, bloodshot eyes pinned the old maester. What does the damned letter say? The king demanded, rubbing his index finger and thumb together with compulsive speed. The ship Pride of the Wind foundered in the bay, Your Grace. Lord Stefan and Lady Cassana drowned against the rocks. The sea swallowed the entire vessel. The king went still, his mouth opened, revealing pale gums. He blinked his dry eyes 3 times in a row. Drowned, Aerys whispered. He turned his thin body and pointed a long, dirty finger toward the massive doors of the council chamber. Tywin Lannister, that fattened lion. Pycelle raised his head. Your Grace, the storm was natural. The winds on the narrow sea. Silence, old fool, Aerys shouted, his voice spraying saliva across his own lips. He moved toward Pycelle, fists clenched. He guessed. The Lannister sniffed out my intentions. He knew I was going to make Stefan my new hand. Aerys drove his nails into his own cheek. A bead of fresh blood ran down through the sparse beard to the pointed chin. He sank the bloody ship. Magic, bribed assassins, treason, the king screamed, gesturing wildly. He looked at the Iron Throne and hugged his own thin shoulders, shaking with fury and dread. He killed the Lord of Storm's End to keep me chained. If I strip him of the hand of the king now, the damned man will kill me too. He will poison my cup or cut my throat in the shadows. The North 278 to 280 AC. The snow melted into mud and the ice hardened the dirt roads again. The North bled in small, continuous hemorrhages along its edges, and we entered the open veins. For 2 years, the starlit sky and the leaking roofs of taverns served as camp. We hunted what fled from the long justice of Winterfell. Outlaws who tried to toll merchants lost their hands to Pursue's sword. Ragged deserters from the wall ended with ropes tight around their necks. With each nest of raiders erased, the gates and bridges of the lords unlocked. The Karstarks served barrels of dark ale and carved boar at the tables of Karhold. The Umbers roared their approval at the hearths of Last Hearth. Younger sons and heirs of the great houses of the north began to ride with us. They left the comfort of their stone walls to share the front line on patrol, sleeping in the mud for entire moons before returning to their homes. Where we left ashes of camps and dead scum on the ground, we planted a wooden post carrying a heavy banner. The dark cloth displayed the symbol of Yggdrasil woven in gray thread. The repetition of the standard marked the territory. The fame crossed the neck and spread through the 7 kingdoms. In camps, taverns, and stone halls, the people and the lords gave our group a name without being asked. We came to be called the Wolfpack. The name did not come only from our tactics. Fenrir had grown to the size of a draft pony, a mass of entirely black fur with red eyes that glowed like embers in the dark of the forest. Beside him, Gila moved like a liquid shadow, a shadowcat with disproportionate fangs that tore throats without making a prior sound. The image of the two beasts marching in our vanguard froze the blood of raiders long before the clash of steel. Throughout all of this, I did not set foot in Winterfell's courtyard. My father sent ravens ordering my return, but my answers always reported an unfinished hunt. The reach of my physical absence was covered by ink. The parchments exchanged with Eldrick carried coded reports. He had consolidated the roots of our information web. Attentive ears and quick eyes were spread through every important castle in Westeros. In the great strongholds and the alleys of the port cities, the spymaster had pawns positioned. Beyond that, I had instructed him to keep his focus on Bolton lands. Eldrick had spent the last 2 years covertly collecting and documenting evidence of the continuous flayings and abuses orchestrated by Roose Bolton across his territory. Rosalind also sent frequent ravens. The letters confirmed the weight of the steel Sigurd had begun to raise on his shoulders and the lethal agility Astrid had developed with short blades. The funds I had left her to manage multiplied into heavy profits. In response, I drafted parchments with precise formulas detailing the boiling and preparation of soaps and hygiene extracts. Rosalind built workshops. Moons later, she opened a shop selling articles that drained the silver and gold of lords and ladies accustomed to expensive perfumes covering the smell of sweat, while distributing the rougher, more effective bars in the common markets. In the west, near the frozen rivers of the stony shore, salt water soaked into the boiled leather of our armor. The Ironborn landed on the rocks in rust-stained chainmail with the brainless certainty of those who worship drowning. The black smoke rising from the coastal village guided our gallop. We entered the small bay of mud and gravel at the end of the day. A dozen Ironborn were felling ancient pines at the edge of the slope, stacking the wood to carry onto the ships anchored at the rocks. In the center of the mud circle, the corpse of a villager lay face down. The skull, split in half, leaked fresh blood into the earth. A few meters from the pool of blood, 3 Ironborn had a weeping woman pinned against a felled trunk, tearing at the thick fabric of her dress. Further on, a girl of no more than 14 screamed as a warrior with massive shoulders crushed her wrists against the snow with one hand and worked at his belt buckle with the other. The Valyrian steel left my scabbard with a sharp sound. Kevin's bowstring snapped beside me. The arrow with its dark steel point passed through the side of the man's neck above the girl, the tip coming out clean through the front of his throat. The warrior gurgled, eyes rolling back as the heavy body collapsed into the salt mud. "Kill them," I ordered. The Ironborn dropped their prey and raised shields and boarding axes. Pursue struck the enemy formation's flank like a boulder falling. The heavy blade of his greatsword split the top of the first oak shield and drove deep into the defender's collarbone, shattering the bone with a crack. Morgoth spun his short spear and skewered the second aggressor's gut with the efficiency of an unsullied soldier. Fenrir and Gila moved as lethal blurs. Fenrir leapt onto a fully mailed man, his jaws breaking the forearm that held the steel. Gila tore the throat of an archer who was reaching for his second arrow. I walked in a straight line toward the camp's leader. He wore fish-scale armor and wielded a curved axe in both hands. His face had dry ash marking the pale cheeks. He roared in my direction and swung the weapon in a wide arc. I turned my torso to the right, letting the heavy blade cut only cold air. The weapon's weight pulled his balance forward. My dark dagger cut the tendon of his right knee with a clean twist of the wrist. The man shouted and buckled, dropping into the mud. I drove my steel boot with crushing force into the side of his face, snapping the jawbone and throwing him onto his back. The fight did not last a full minute. 11 bodies bled dead across the ruined camp. The woman crawled through the earth, sobbing without stop, and grabbed the girl, pulling rags of cloth to cover the frightened daughter's bare skin. Belzakar stopped near them, turned his back to the two, and lowered his spear into a silent defensive perimeter. I looked at the fallen leader. He tried to drag himself on his elbows, choking on the blood rising from the broken jaw. Pursue grabbed him by the scale armor and hauled him to the widest pine trunk at the edge of the bay, forcing him to sit with his back against the thick wood. "Remove the coat and his shirt," I said, sheathing the longsword and keeping the dagger in hand. "Tie his wrists up high." Kevin and Pursue used thick ropes to bind the man's arms wide against firm branches, stretching the flesh until the shoulder joints pulled taut. The wet, bare skin of his back lay completely stretched and exposed. The Ironborn leader spat in my direction, blood staining his own lips. "The drowned god awaits me. You can cut. I am not sending you to the bottom of the sea," I said, moving behind him. This is not a judgment. It is a sacrifice to the forest blood you spilled. I pressed the fine tip of the Valyrian steel against the bare nape of his neck. I drew the blade down, splitting the skin and thick muscle along every cervical vertebra. The flesh opened with the ease of paper. The warm blood poured down the long incision, soaking his leather waistband. The man contracted the muscles of his back, drawing air in through clenched teeth. I continued the line of the sharp cut along the entire spine, down to the rigid base of the lumbar. I switched the dagger to my right hand and sank my rigid fingers between the cut flesh and the bony base of his back, feeling the ribs connected to the spine. With the blade seated exactly at the junction of the first lower rib, I applied brute pressure. The Valyrian steel cut through the bone with a hollow snap. The cartilage split. The Ironborn released the first sharp howl of extreme torment. I repeated the motion on the other ribs. The sound of the bones separating from the dorsal spine under the dagger recalled pieces of dry stick breaking under heavy boots. His chest cavity gave way and the lungs began to expand in a chaotic pattern. I opened the bone connections on the other side of the back and folded the hard skeletal structure outward with both hands, exposing the rear vital organs. The warrior groaned loose, his eyes rolling in their sockets as the pain flooded the brain's function. I put the dagger away. I reached my bare hands through the hot, spinal gap of the chest cavity and gripped the wet, spongy base of both lungs. I pulled the vital organs outward with a jerk of pure force. The internal tissue stretched, accommodating the two pulmonary lobes over the frame of the ribs folded back, forming the symmetrical shape of two large, bloody wings of flesh on the man's back. The final gasp of shock inflated the hanging lungs one last time before emptying completely. The head fell forward, the chin pressing against the bloodied chest. Life left its moorings. The stench of relaxed entrails and heavy copper stained the base of the pine. I walked to an untouched bank of fresh snow, plunged both hands into the white ice, and scrubbed my fingers until the freezing water stripped every layer of thick clots and loose cartilage from my skin. Barrowden, 279 AC. The smell of burning black peat and damp hay dominated the central yard of Barrowden. The Dustin house had a noisy castle. Draft horses whinnied near the long stables and the sound of hammers against steel anvils filled the conversations of the day. I rode into the yard on Sleipnir. A circle of men was shouting near the wide stone water troughs. A tall young man with long dark hair plastered to his forehead and trousers dirty with wet mud had one heavy knee pressed against the chest of a garrison guard. The guard's arm was stretched backward in a dangerous close combat lock. "Yield," the man shouted, the laugh ringing in the air with pure amusement. The guard hammered his free hand into the packed earth, choking. The young man loosened his grip, rose in a quick jump and extended his closed fist, pulling the guard upright with force. Sweat darkened the armpits of his shirt, and blood ran bright from a fresh cut splitting the lower lip. Brandon Stark wiped his wrist across the blood at his mouth. The wild wolf turned his heels in the dust. The gray eyes locked onto the black plates of my armor and the two wolf-sized ponies at my side. He shoved two lancers aside to open a path and crossed the yard with long, predatory strides. Brandon grabbed the thick fabric at the shoulder of my armor and drove the front of his body against mine in a rough embrace that sounded like two mounts colliding. The smell of animal sweat, spilled strong ale, and old leather came from his pores. "Arthur," he said, his hoarse voice muffled in the padding of my gorget. He stepped back and gripped both my arms, taking in what he saw. The sharp eyes read the hardened dust on my boots, the deadly blades carried by the silent unsullied lancers behind me, and Kevin's still posture. The wild smile that defined his title stretched his cracked lips again. "They tell it by the fires that you have been leaving heads and guts hanging from every damned pine from Winterfell to the waterline, brother," Brandon roared, slapping his heavy palm against the metal of my breastplate. "The smell of your ambushes has crossed leagues to reach here. Come, the Dustins brew a thick dark ale that bitters the tongue and drops the legs from a bear." White Harbor, 280 AC. The cutting wind sweeping the open yards of White Harbor smelled of salt spray and fish guts in brine. Gray gulls cawed in circles around the tallest masts of the ships anchored at the dock. The walls of the new castle displayed white stones polished by water, completely unlike the mud and black ice of the other northern strongholds. I stepped onto the paved ground of the eastern courtyard. The plates of my armor clinked in a heavy rhythm. I left the others tying the travel mounts near the stone water troughs. I walked toward the lines of straw training dummies kept by the garrison. The sound of solid wood cracking the air caught my attention. A slender young man with brown hair tied tight at the base of his neck drove consecutive cuts of a heavy practice sword against the torn covering of a dummy. The loose linen shirt stuck to the wet skin of his back. He stepped firm with his right leg, rotated the torso against the ribs, and brought the blunt blade down across the motionless enemy's flank. I stopped 2 steps from the training stakes. He caught the approach at the corner of his eye and turned at the same speed as the last blow, raising the wooden hilt to chin level with both arms rigid and ready. His thin chest rose and fell, seeking air through a dry mouth. The gray eyes, hard and trained, read the size of the dagger fixed to my thigh and locked on my chin. The level of the wooden point dropped a few millimeters in hesitation. "Arthur," Benjen said, losing the breath on the last syllable. His right hand opened. The rough sword struck the paved stone and rolled between his boots. The youngest of the brothers did not carry Brandon's mountain of muscle or Ned's impenetrable posture, but the quick instincts of the North already lived under his skin. Benjen closed the distance and locked both arms around my waist, pressing the side of his face against the iron buckles of my belt. "Father sent word saying you crossed the wall in the Forgotten Forts," Benjen said, his voice muffled against the leather. He broke the embrace and pulled his lean shoulders back, flicking the drops from his forehead with the back of his muddy wrist. "The whole castle bet coins you were going to take the vows of the Night's Watch." "I crossed the snow and ice to honor a late promise, Benjen. I am not locking my boots to the ice battlements," I said. I let my eyes drop to the mangled dummy on the wooden post. "The rotation axis of your ankles locked too wide on that last oblique cut. The straw of the dummy absorbs the impact because it has no hands to counter your blind side, but the curved tip of a mercenary's steel would have sliced the unprotected muscle of your thigh from end to end in the same breath it took for the blow." Benjen dropped his gray eyes to the stone floor, ran back through the body memory of his own movement, and looked back up at me. The boy stretched his leg, slipped the toe of his boot under the worn training hilt, and kicked the piece of wood into the air, catching the handle in the same motion. His knuckles tightened firm around the leather grip. "Then take a shield and show me exactly where the distance is wrong," Benjen said, straightening his spine and raising the hilt to eye level. "King's Landing, Red Keep, 280 AC. The small council chamber smelled of thick, floral incense. A failed attempt to mask the smell of sour sweat and neglect that came off Aerys II Targaryen. The king occupied the head of the oak table. His yellowed nails, the size of broken blades, scraped the polished wood in compulsive movements. His bloodshot eyes moved from one counselor to the next without blinking. The discussion flowed over preparations for the great royal event. "Princess Elia of Dorne will arrive with her retinue before the next moon, Your Grace," Grand Maester Pycelle reported, his hands resting on the heavy chains at his neck. "The provisions for the banquet are already being counted in the storerooms. It will be a wedding worthy of Prince Rhaegar's lineage." Aerys stopped scratching the table. The king turned his bony face toward the maester, thin lips pulling back. "Enough Dornish at my table," Aerys cut in, his voice hoarse and strained. "That permanent smell of strong pepper and red sand turns my stomach. As if what they bring on their ships were not enough. Halt the preparations until I say to resume." The entire council fell into absolute silence. Pycelle swallowed his answer and lowered his head. Aerys turned his pointed face toward Lord Varys' seat. "Spider," the king called, pointing the long dirty finger. "What do your dark rats whisper? Give me something useful to clean my ears. The kingdom does not consist of arranged marriages and wasteful feasts." Varys smiled, a contained and soft movement, joining his white, smooth hands in his lap. "Your Grace," Varys's gentle voice slid across the chamber. "There was a land dispute between minor lords in the Reach, easily resolved by Lord Tyrell. There is an excess of mercenaries drinking in the streets of Aldtown, awaiting contracts. However, there is a far more interesting song rising from the frozen lands of the north of late." Aerys stopped moving his hands. The king's attention fixed on the master of whisperers. "They call themselves the Wolfpack, Your Grace," Varys continued, his shrewd little eyes brightening. "A small, lethally mounted group led by a young man called Arthur Snow, the bastard son of Lord Rickard Stark. They say the boy marches flanked by shadow beasts. His group has spent the last 2 years sweeping the forests, roads, and coasts of the entire north. Assassins, deserting mercenaries, and raiding Ironborn do not reach judgment in Winterfell. The Wolfpack condemns them on the roads with grotesque rituals of blood and blade." Varys made a calculated pause, smoothing the silk of his own tunic. "They plant standards wherever they pass. The North, at this exact moment, is pacified in a brutal and savage fashion. There is not a single road bandit or rapist who dares step onto the trails cutting between the castles of the region without losing his entrails. Aerys blinked his dry eyelids. The king stopped picking at the crusts on his own neck. The silence extended in the council chamber. Slowly, a broken smile, showing diseased gums, split the gaunt face of Aerys Targaryen. The king turned his bloodshot eyes to Simon Staunton, who had taken the post of Master of Laws following the Baratheon lord's death. "Staunton," Aerys called, his voice vibrating with sudden, feverish enthusiasm. "Have you not spent the last entire moon at this same table whining and rubbing your eyes over that damned Brotherhood of the Kingswood? Thieves stealing my deer and my taxes at the door of my own capital." Simon Staunton straightened his spine, his pale skin pulling with nerves. "Yes, Your Grace," Staunton said, stumbling slightly. "The city watch has proven insufficient in the incursions into the forest. The outlaws hide like worms and then send the ravens to Winterfell immediately." Aerys cut him off, slapping his palm on the wood and throwing his own body forward. The dirty gray hair swayed around his sharp face. "Call that lethal bastard. Call his wolf pack of beasts." The king let out a rasping laugh that rang off the stone ceiling. "If they enjoy hunting scum in the ice so much, bring them here. Let us see up close how Lord Stark's wolves fare hunting inside my forest." Chapter 35 King's Landing. Castle Serwyn, 280 AC. The great hall of Castle Serwyn smelled of roasted pork and spilled ale. The fire crackled in the large stone hearths, warming the guests of the funeral feast. The old lord rested in the crypts, and the high seat now belonged to Major Serwyn. In the center of the hall, a bard plucked the strings of a worn lute. His voice echoed in the wooden beams, singing the lively verses of the Dornishman's wife. Horn cups knocked together in time with the music. I bit into a piece of hard bread. The castle's maester, a short man with a chain of fine links at his neck, slipped behind the main table. He leaned in and whispered near Major's ear, sliding a sealed parchment across the wood. Lord Serwyn broke the seal. His eyes ran over the ink. He nodded slowly to the maester and raised his face, searching our table in the middle of the hall. His hand gestured in my direction. I rose from the oak bench and walked to the dais. "Arthur," Major said, his voice carried the roughness of exhaustion. He held out the crumpled parchment. "Your father sent an urgent raven from Winterfell. King Aerys has issued a decree. He demands your presence, and that of your entire wolf pack, in the capital." The bard kept singing, but the nearest tables went quiet. The weight of the king's title pushed a rigid silence through the hall like a current of cold air, swallowing the murmurs and the knocking of cups against the wooden tables. "The king wants you to ride south," Major continued, lowering his voice to keep the conversation close. "The order is to hunt the Kingswood Brotherhood. They have been tormenting the Crown lands." Kevin stopped beside me. He crossed his arms over his leather chest, reading the paper in the Lord's hand. "Seems our fame has reached even the king's ears," Kevin said. I stayed quiet, running through the map and the weight of the summons. I nodded once to the new Lord Serwyn. "Thank you, my friend. I will need a favor," I said. "Send a return raven to my father. Tell him I am heading to King's Landing. I will sail from White Harbor on a direct ship south. Tell him that after the Kingswood hunt is resolved, I will return to Winterfell." Major Serwyn folded the parchment and rested both hands on the table. "Do you need men from my lands to reinforce your group?" the Lord asked. "That will not be necessary," I answered. Major looked at Pursue sharpening the edge of his axe at our table and at the enormous shapes of Fenrir and Hela sleeping near the corner hearths. He knew the trails we had left across the northern roads. The Lord did not press. We left the feast tables and withdrew to our quarters. The gray dawn found us mounted in the courtyard, filing out through the wooden gates. White Harbor, 280 AC. The ride east would mark the end of dry leather. The dense smell of salted fish and tidal mud hid my face long before the walls of White Harbor appeared on the horizon. We rode into the city over smooth stone paving. Wylus Manderley waited near the rise of the new castle. The man carried a generous belly and a thick walrus mustache that hid his mouth almost entirely. "Arthur Snow," Wylus greeted, extending his thick hands. "My father's halls are warm and ready. I will order a feast prepared for your blades." "I appreciate the hospitality, Wylus, but I cannot sit at your table," I interrupted, pulling Sleipnir's reins to hold the horse. "I am under direct orders. I need to sail for King's Landing as quickly as possible." Sweat shone on the Manderley's forehead despite the cold ocean wind. He rubbed his fingers, uneasy. Any mention of a mad king's summons stiffened the muscles of every heir in the north. "It will be brief," I added, cutting through his discomfort. "Can you tell me where Benjen is?" "The young Stark left last cycle," Wylus answered, pointing his fleshy hand toward the docks. "He took goods to Bravos. He has taken a real liking to trading in open sales." "Right." Wylus dismissed the guard and walked ahead of our mounts, guiding us through the steep streets to the central docks. The port operated in a noisy chaos of sailors unloading barrels and nets caught in pulleys. The Manderly spoke quickly with the captain of a merchant galley called the Moonshadow. The seafarer assessed our long swords and the size of the 2 giant wolves before spitting into the sea and accepting the coins. "You have exactly 2 hours before the tide turns and the winds die," Wylus warned. "He will cast off on schedule." "That is enough. Thank you, Wylus," I said. I dismounted from Sleipnir onto the wet planks of the dock. Kevin, Pursue, Belzakar, and Morgause climbed down from their horses after me. "Pull our gear, packs, and weapons from the saddlebags," I said, pointing toward the ship's ramp. "Take the horses to the city stables and pay for their feed. We pick them all up when we return. Get the equipment on board." I left the group pulling at the ropes and turned my back to the sea. I walked through the wet, slippery alleys of White Harbor. The dark stone walls showed streaks of moss running down the shallow gutters. The smell of wet rot soaked into the cold mist. I stopped in front of a sign of rotted oak, held up by rusted chains. The letters scratched into the wood read "The Black Hand." I pushed the door open. The tavern reeked of old urine and the dregs of sour ale barrels. The low ceiling forced the smoke from the fish oil lamps to hang at eye level. The hall held fewer than half a dozen men hunched over tables, drinking in silence. The instant my boots cracked on the wooden floor, 3 pairs of eyes fixed on the knives at my belt, then dropped back to the foam in their cups. No one was looking to test the steel of a man who moved like he lived to use it. I approached the counter covered in knife grooves. The barkeep, a stocky man with scars covering half his thick neck, was scrubbing the inside of a horn cup with a dirty linen cloth. "What will you have?" His voice came out like gravel being crushed, eyes not leaving his own hand. I reached my left hand inside the opening of my leather doublet. My fingers found the parchment. I pulled the letter out and set the folded edge flat on the wet wood of the counter, sliding it forward. The yellow light of the lamp wavered and lit the unbroken red wax seal at the center of the paper. The impression pressed into the wax showed a perfectly open hand with a human eye carved splitting the palm. The barkeep stopped the rotating motion of his wrist. The linen cloth slipped and fell to the floor behind the counter. He focused on the pressed wax, then dragged his eyes slowly up until they stopped on my face. The man's loose shoulders locked into absolute military rigidity. The expression of disinterest vanished. "Follow me, my lord," the barkeep said, turning his back and opening the narrow door hidden behind the storage barrels. I followed him into one of the back rooms. He opened the door and we entered a space that had nothing to do with the misery of the main hall. It was, in its way, comfortable. Wall shelves packed with heavy tomes shared space with a solid dark oak table. The barkeep's posture shifted the moment he crossed the threshold. His spine straightened, carrying an air of discipline. In the center of the room, 2 sofas faced each other across a low wooden table. "Sit. Would you like something to drink, my lord?" the barkeep asked. "No, thank you. I will be brief," I said, sitting on the sofa. "Of course. How can I help you? Do you know who I am?" I asked. The barkeep sat on the sofa across from me. "I do not know you, my lord. I only received orders that if a letter bearing this seal ever reached me, I was to do everything in my power to help," he answered. "I need you to send a message directly to Her Mater," I said. At the name Her Mater, the barkeep's expression shifted to pure reverence. "It seems you are close to Lord Her Mater," he said. "I am. He serves me," I answered with a slight smile. The reverence on the man's face broke and gave way to rigid surprise. "I apologize for my manners, my lord. I did not know I was speaking to the Grand Woden. Give me the message and it will be delivered with the highest priority," the man answered, his voice going tight. Gods, these names are an embarrassment. Must be Rosalind's doing, I thought, pulling an unsealed letter from inside the doublet. "Here, thank you for your help," I said, handing the paper over. "No thanks needed. I work for you. Is there anything else I can do?" the man asked. I held the thought for a moment. "Do you have information on the Kingswood Brotherhood?" I asked. "I do. Give me a moment." The barkeep rose and walked to the shelves. He removed several thick books and revealed a hollow hidden in the wall, packed with rolls and letters. He searched through the papers until he found what he wanted and returned to the table carrying a small bundle of parchments bound by a strip of leather darkened with age. He tilted his head slightly in respect before setting the documents in front of me. I glanced at the text and saw it was written in a completely disjointed form. I recognized what it was immediately and smiled. Seems Eldrick and Rosalind have been doing excellent work, I thought, recognizing the substitution logic of the cipher. The barkeep settled back into his chair. The Kingswood Brotherhood. His voice dropped. Most nobles call them common criminals. Killers, thieves, deserters. A small, tired smile formed on his face. But the people of the Kingswood tend to speak of them differently. He opened one of the parchments. Many of those who joined the Brotherhood were peasants crushed by taxes, men driven from their lands, or soldiers abandoned after the wars. The forest took them all in. His eyes moved quickly over the encrypted lines. Over time, dangerous men rose among them, men capable of turning starving fugitives into something close to a small army. He separated one letter from the rest. Simon Toyne was the leader. Intelligent, patient, he was not the kind of man who charged screaming into a battle. He planned ambushes like a veteran commander. He chose wealthy targets, avoided unnecessary losses, and kept the Brotherhood together. The barkeep drummed his fingers slowly on the table. House Toyne once held prestige before the crown destroyed them almost entirely. Some believe Simon grew up watching his bloodline disappear while other houses prospered on their knees before the Iron Throne. He let out a low laugh. Perhaps the Brotherhood began as revenge. Perhaps as survival. But they say Simon did not only want gold. His eyes came up to meet mine. He wanted to prove that lords bleed the same as any other man. He opened another letter. Big Belly Ben. Pure brute force. Large as an aurochs. The man shook his head. There are accounts of men having ribs broken through armor from his blows. He likely started as a mercenary. Too large to live as a simple peasant. Some swear he fought in the disputed lands before returning to Westeros without a coin. He shrugged. Simon found him fighting in underground pits near King's Landing, killing men for copper. He pulled a smaller parchment. Fletcher Dick was different. Silent. An exceptional archer. The man pointed to his own throat. They say entire patrols would cross the forest without ever realizing he had been watching them from the treetops. Some claim Fletcher is one of the finest archers alive in Westeros. A hunter from childhood, he could bring down birds in full flight before he was old enough to carry a sword. The barkeep gave a small smile. Lords tried to recruit him many times, but Fletcher hated nobles almost as much as he hated tax collectors. He pointed to another name written on the parchment. It was Fletcher who taught Ulmer to use the bow. The barkeep raised an eyebrow and a short laugh escaped him. They say Ulmer can hit apples on the top of stakes at hundreds of paces, but even he admitted he never reached Fletcher's level. He opened the next letter. Wenda, the White Fawn. His expression hardened slightly. They say she was the daughter of a small sheep farmer near the Stormlands. Young, pretty. He went quiet for a moment. Pretty enough to attract the wrong attention. The barkeep rested his arms on the table. A member of House Catherine reportedly violated the girl and murdered her family to keep it buried. Wenda disappeared shortly after. He pointed to a symbol drawn in the corner of the parchment. Today she brands the men she captures with the mark of a white fawn burned into the skin. A cold smile formed on his face. Many soldiers prefer to die fighting rather than fall alive into her hands. Then he reached for the last parchment. The smiling night. Even the ambient sound of the room seemed to quiet. That one was the worst of them. The man let the air out slowly. Or perhaps the most dangerous. Depends on who tells the story. His fingers touched the edge of the table. Some say he was born in the Reach, a younger son of a small knightly house. A prodigy with the sword from childhood. The barkeep shook his head slowly. They say he held to the knightly vows almost fanatically. Perhaps that was the mistake. He leaned slightly forward. According to the rumors, the man confronted his lord after witnessing abuses against peasants. The lord charged him with treason and slander. The barkeep ran his fingers across his own lips. As punishment, they removed his lips and condemned him to the wall. His eyes dropped to the parchment. But the convoy never reached the north. It was found massacred days later. Bodies scattered across the road, horses split from neck to belly. He raised his gaze slowly. Not long after, a knight with a lipless grin began appearing in the forests of the Kingswood. The silence sat between us for a few seconds while he closed the parchments one by one. The Kingswood is their real strength, my lord. The barkeep unrolled a simple map on the table. They know every trail, every stream, every hidden cave. Crown patrols enter there blind. His finger traced several markings made in thin ink. And they have the support of the people. Farmers hide wounded members. Hunters supply food. Some villages trust the Brotherhood over the king's men. He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders relaxing. That is what makes the Kingswood Brotherhood dangerous. His eyes met mine again. They are not outlaws hiding in a forest. They are men and women the realm ground down, and who chose to grind back. A smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. Sounds like an interesting group, I thought. Ryan did not ask why I wanted that information, but whatever my intention was, he wished me luck. I thanked the barkeep. I left several gold dragons on the oak table. Ryan tried to refuse payment from his own employer, but I pushed the coins toward him and insisted. I said my farewell, stepped back out through the doors of the Black Hand into the wet alleys, and walked quickly toward the ship at the dock. I climbed the wooden ramp of the Moonshadow. On deck, near the freshwater barrels, Kevin and Morgause were playing cards on an upturned crate. The salt breeze was already pulling at the ends of our cloaks. "Everyone ready?" I asked, stopping beside the crate. "Yes," Kevin answered, eyes not leaving the worn cards in his hand. The galley captain began shouting sharp orders from the helm. Sailors ran along the ropes. The canvas sails beat hard, stretching against the wind, and the ship cast off from the dock, cutting through the waters of the White Knife toward open sea. 11 days of salt, cold, and creaking wood passed. The gray horizon broke open for a dark mass pushing through the morning mist. Dragonstone did not look like a castle built by human hands. The structure seemed to have been vomited from the bowels of the earth. The towers of black rock twisted toward the sky in the shapes of pointed claws, grotesque dragons, and stone batwings. On the peak of the island, the mouth of the volcano smoked slowly, drawing a line of gray against the flat sky. The waves struck with violence against the dark cliffs. The air near the coast smelled of wet basalt and ancient sulfur. One day later, the capital appeared. The smell hit the hull of the ship long before the Red Keep came into view. It was a physical wall of stench, thick and warm. The air reeked of exposed sewage, human waste baking in the sun, rotting fish, and old meat. Fenrir and Hela pulled their ears back at almost the same moment. The giant wolf snorted, lowered his head, and dragged his wet muzzle against his front paws repeatedly, trying to scrub the smell from his nostrils. The shadowcat curled her long body tight and covered her black nose with a paw, her yellow eyes watering against the acid air of the bay. The Moonshadow maneuvered between dozens of galleys and merchant barges. We docked at the quay of the Blackwater Bay port with a hollow thud against the wet timber piles. We took our camp packs, travel bags, and weapons. Before going down to the main deck area, I pulled strips of thick linen from my kit. I wrapped the scabbard, guard, and hilt of Dark Sister repeatedly, hiding the weapon's shape in dark leather under plain fabric. The Valyrian steel needed to stay concealed in the middle of the capital. We came down the boarding ramp with packs on our shoulders. Our boots struck the dirty stone of the port. A bald man waited at the edge of the quay, flanked by half a dozen guards in crimson cloaks and polished steel mail. He wore fine silks that gave off a sickening smell of lavender powder, a thick perfume trying to fight the city's rot. His white, soft hands rested crossed at the level of his round belly. His eyes slid across my scratched armor, assessed the greatsword on Pursue's back, Morgause's spear, and then dropped to the two black beasts now moving at exactly the height of my leather belt. "Arthur Snow, I presume," the man said. The smile opened his plump lips but did not reach the cold, shrewd eyes. "Indeed," I answered, stopping at a safe distance from the escort. "And you must be the famous Lord Varys." "Lord," he replied. The voice came out thin and smooth. He raised his hands in a gesture of calculated humility. "I hold no lands, no castle, no title. I am deeply grateful you made the journey to the capital," Varys said, folding his soft hands back over his round belly. "A summons from the king himself is not a request," I answered, adjusting the weight of the pack on my shoulder. "It cannot be refused." The eunuch nodded with a slow movement of his bald head. His lavender perfume nearly drowned the smell of rotting fish around us. "Without a doubt, if you will follow me," Varys said, turning his back to the bay. "I took the liberty of reserving the finest rooms in the cleanest inn in King's Landing for your wolfpack." The crimson-cloaked guards opened the way ahead, pushing dock hands and merchants aside with the shafts of their spears. We followed just behind. Fenrir and Hela walked pressed against my legs, their heavy paws stepping around the puddles of dirty water. Passers-by stopped abruptly and pressed their bodies against the wooden walls of the warehouses to get clear of the wolf's red eyes and the shadowcat's fangs. "When will I be brought before the king?" I asked, keeping pace beside Varys. "You will not," the master of whisperers answered, his gentle voice cutting through the squeal of cart wheels. "His grace carries the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders and has other priorities at the moment. A member of the royal family, however, has shown deep interest in the stories of your band. You will be received tomorrow morning." Varys slipped his hand into his silk sleeve and pulled out a pale handkerchief. He brought it to his nose with delicate precision. "That will give you time to rest from the long voyage," he continued, his voice muffled by the cloth, his eyes bright with a polished calculation. "And to take long baths with hot water. The narrow sea and the blood of the roads have left a quaint, rustic odor on you." The dense smell of old sweat, dirty leather, and weeks without washing was embedded in our clothes. Kevin scratched at his beard, crusted with sea salt. Morgause simply repositioned the spear on his shoulder. "Show us the way to the inn," I said. Chapter 36 Reunion. The path from the docks to the inn demanded force to push through the crowd. Varys walked ahead. His soft velvet shoes seemed to glide over the dark mud of Muddy Way without throwing a single drop of filth. The crimson-cloaked escort opened the way, pushing merchants and beggars aside with the wooden shafts of their spears. The labyrinth of uneven alleys of King's Landing seethed with thousands of compressed bodies. Dark thatched roofs and cracked clay tiles crushed against each other on the slopes. Black smoke from forges and street fires covered the capital in a dirty haze, staining the evening light. Far above, on top of Aegon's Hill, the Red Keep dominated the skyline. The stone of the round towers and the monstrous battlements held the flat color of dried blood. The noise of the streets formed a continuous roar. Cart wheels cracked on the loose paving stones. Blacksmiths hammered steel and merchants bellowed the prices of salted fish. We passed a city watch patrol. The gold of their cloaks stood out against the filth of the sidewalk. They walked in tight formation, gloved hands resting fixed on the pommels of their short swords. One of the guards kicked the bowl of a beggar blocking the gutter. The wood cracked against the wall. The man crawled aside, sinking his hands into the mud and waste. Long banners with the three-headed red dragon hung from the stone balconies of the taller buildings. The capital was swollen past its structural limit. "King's Landing overflows," Varys remarked, walking with his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "Prince Rhaegar's wedding to Princess Elia Martell will take place in a few weeks. The promise of extravagant feasts and court favors has dragged retinues of lords, hedge knights, and mercenaries inside our walls." Fenrir and Hela walked pressed against my legs. Their heavy paws stepped around the puddles of dirty water. Passers-by stopped abruptly and shrank against the wooden walls of the warehouses to get clear of the wolf's red eyes and the shadowcat's fangs. We stopped in front of a three-story inn near the foot of Visenia's Hill, where the air smelled less of sewage and more of burning wood. The foundation was pale stone and thick waxed oak beams. An iron sign swung in the sea breeze, displaying the drawing of a crown of flowers. "Your rest," Varys said, stopping before the double door. He kept his eyes away from Hela, who had driven her claws into the wood of the doorframe to sharpen the tips. "The innkeepers have already been generously paid with the crown's silver. Hot water, clean sheets, and quality soap await you." The eunuch opened a polished smile. "The soap comes from a new shop that has taken the court and the nobility by storm," Varys continued, his dark eyes brightening with silent amusement. "They sell hygiene items so peculiar that women form long queues on the pavement just to buy the bars. One of the largest buyers today is Queen Rhaella herself." I bit the inside of my cheek. The formulas sent to Rosslyn in the north were bathing royalty in the south. Varys slid his pale hands back inside his wide silk sleeves. "Someone will knock on your door in the early hours of the morning," the eunuch instructed, his soft voice dripping politeness. "A trusted man will guide you through the streets to the exact location of the meeting. The capital is a confusing labyrinth for those who come from the north." "We will be ready," I answered, keeping my hand near the leather belt. "Before I leave you," Varys paused, his gaze sliding back to the two predators. "I recommend caution with your animals. The city is packed with every kind of man because of the wedding. Thieves, mercenaries, and drunk fools seeking fame. Someone may attempt something unfortunate." "I appreciate the warning," I answered. Varys dipped his bald head in a short bow and turned his heavy body on his heels. The master of whisperers retraced the path along the cobbled street, flanked by the guard soldiers, until he disappeared into the evening mist. Pursue watched the eunuch's silhouette vanish into the grimy crowd. I have never seen so many miserable people per square foot, the warrior said, his hand resting near the guard of his greatsword. Speaking of which, Arthur, who do you think the royal family member is that will meet us tomorrow? That is obvious, I said, a quick smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. Seems we are about to meet the most famous groom in the Seven Kingdoms. Kevin shook his head the moment he was sure the Crimson Cloaks had turned the corner. That bald man gives me chills, Kevin muttered, rubbing his arms under his own hardened leather tunic. I swear I prefer the smell of shit from the street over that lavender perfume. I let out a short laugh. I put my arm over Kevin's shoulders and steered the hunter toward the double door of the inn. Come, the smell of shit you already have, I said. We pushed through the doors of the Crown of Flowers. The interior smelled of roasted mutton, braised garlic, and wine spilled into wood. The main hall was wide and well kept, lit by wrought iron chandeliers and two polished stone hearths crackling at each end. The round oak tables showed no knife grooves or old stains. Heavy tapestries with floral embroidery covered the masonry walls, muffling the noise of the cart wheels on the street. A middle-aged woman in a clean green wool dress and an immaculate white apron approached our group. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second at Hella's fangs and Fenrir's size, but she forced her professional composure immediately. My lords, she said, joining her hands in front of her body. The expenses have been fully paid. Hot baths are already prepared in the tubs. Food can be served here in the lower hall or delivered directly to your quarters. To the quarters, I answered. Certainly, the woman nodded, swallowing. I beg your pardon for the inconvenience, but the city is completely full because of Prince Rhaegar and Princess Elia Myrtle's ceremony. We only had 3 rooms available at the time of the reservation. There is no way for each of you to have your own space. We accept without issue, I said. We had spent the last years sleeping on frozen roots, wet stones, and bloody mud. A dry straw mattress would already have been an absurd luxury. We will divide up, I said, taking the 3 heavy iron keys from the innkeeper's hand. Pursue and Kevin take 1 room. Morgause and Belzacar in the second. I take the third. I looked down. The giant wolf snorted, shaking his black coat, and the shadowcat dragged her flank across my boot. I would not be alone, after all. I thanked the woman with a nod. I handed the keys to the others. We turned our backs to the hall tables and climbed the wide oak staircase toward hot water and heavy sleep. I opened the door to my room. The space held an unusual luxury for the rot of the street outside. The floor was covered by a thick rug of dyed wool. A canopied bed occupied the center, with high pillows and white sheets pulled taut. In the corner, near the window with velvet curtains, a large copper tub steamed, revealing the hot water inside. I dropped the packs and blades onto the bed. I removed the armor, the mud-stiff trousers, and the sweat-soaked tunic, throwing the dirty cloth into a pile on the floor, and walked straight to the bath. I sank into the water. The heat needled the skin and entered the pores in seconds. I rested the back of my neck on the cold copper rim and let out a long breath, emptying my lungs. Do not think you two are escaping a bath as well, I said, turning my face toward the rug. Fenrir and Hela were already lying down, heads resting on their front paws. The moment I find a clean lake, you both go straight in. Fenrir snorted through his nostrils, closing his red eyes. Hela ignored the sound of my voice entirely. The heat dissolved my sense of time. Short knocks sounded on the wooden door. Come in, I said. The iron handle turned. A young woman, holding a silver tray loaded with steaming dishes, stepped 2 paces inside. Her eyes dropped from my face in the tub to the 2 black beasts on the floor. A trapped scream scraped her throat in a thin squeak. She jolted backward, her back striking the wooden door. The metal of the tray rattled loudly in her hands. Her cheeks burned a vivid red in the same instant. Forgive me, my lord, the girl murmured, her voice thin and unsteady. She turned her face to the floorboards, avoiding my nudity in the water and the wolf's size. I did not see. It is nothing. Come in, I answered, stretching my arm over the rim of the tub. Leave the tray on the table. She moved around the rug in short, rigid steps, her shoulders pulled up nearly to her ears, and set the silver down on the oak. Take the gold coin on top of the table. As a tip, I said. The girl froze mid-motion. Her hand stretched out with hesitation and her short fingers closed around the heavy dragon. She raised her face. Her mouth opened and closed without producing a single sound. Tears filled her eyes and ran down her cheeks. The smile that broke through her trembling lips was absolute. What is your name? I asked. Marga, my lord, she answered, her voice catching, pressing the coin against her apron. She glanced at the pile of stained leather and dirty linen thrown near the bed. "Would you like me to take your clothes to be washed? The washerwomen still have the vats of hot water and soap going in the back." "That would be excellent, Marga. Take them," I answered. "And I need you to bring some large pieces of meat for my friends as well." "Right away, my lord." She nodded quickly and repeatedly. She walked fast to the pile of clothes, gathered the dirty fabric keeping her body as far as possible from the beasts, and left the room in a hurry. I got out of the tub. The water ran off my body and wet the wood. I took a thick cotton towel, dried my skin, and pulled on only a clean pair of leather trousers from my pack. I left my chest and stomach bare. I sat at the table and began to cut the meat on my plate. The door knocked again minutes later. "Come in." Marga pushed the door open with her shoulder. She carried 2 large iron plates with thick, juicy roasted lamb legs. She stopped in the middle of the room. Her eyes searched my face but dropped immediately, locking on my bare torso and the muscles crossed with scars. The skin of the girl's neck and face burned scarlet in the same breath. She blinked rapidly and redirected her gaze to the ceiling, gripping the edge of the plates with white knuckles. I tilted my head toward the rug. The girl swallowed. She walked slowly, knees bending with extreme care, her body leaning backward, trying to maintain the greatest possible physical distance from the beasts without looking at me again. She set the plates on the floor without sound. The smell of bone and fat filled the room. Fenrir and Hela woke at the same instant. The muscles of their backs contracted and both lunged at the pieces, clamping down on the lamb and cracking the bones with sharp, resonant snaps. A quiet laugh escaped me. Marga jumped back, pressed her hands together in front of her apron, and fled the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. I finished my meal and wiped my hands. I walked to the center of the room and let my body drop onto the feather bed. Sleep drowned my vision before I had even pulled the sheet over me. The morning sun broke through the gap in the velvet curtain. I got up from the feather bed, pulled on a clean linen shirt, and buckled the belt with its scabbards. I went out into the corridor. Fenrir and Hela walked just behind. I came down the oak staircase. The lower hall smelled of cooked oats and warm bread. Several people already occupied the benches at the central tables. I walked to a dark corner near the unlit hearth. The giant wolf and the shadow cat lay down on the planks beside my boots. The sound of wooden cups knocking together faded out gradually around us. "Looks like you two will have to stay in the room today," I said quietly, looking at Fenrir's muzzle. "You are drawing too much attention." Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. Kevin and Pursue came down arguing about the price of wine in the capital. Morgause and Belzakar appeared just behind, short spears in hand. The presence of the 4 filled the hall. The whispers started at the neighboring tables. The eyes of merchants and travelers moved from the black fur of the beasts to the scar on the right side of my face. Loose words crossed the air mixed with the sound of spoons. "Wolfpack, direwolf, shadowcat," a mercenary in a worn tunic murmured Demonwolf before turning his face to the wall. The 4 sat around the table. The innkeeper brought bowls of steaming porridge. Kevin winked at the woman and opened a crooked smile. Pursue drove a hard elbow into the archer's ribs, pulling a muffled grunt of air. We started to eat. An oak chair scraped on the floor to my left. A man wrapped in a black cloak sat down at the table. The hood covered his features completely. Nobody had heard his footsteps approach. Kevin lurched on the bench, knocking his spoon into the bowl and letting out a short, sharp sound that scratched his own throat. "It has been a long time, my friend. I missed you," I said, the corner of my mouth pulling up. The man pulled the dark cloth back. Eldric's sharp face appeared in the lamplight. Kevin reached across the table and grabbed the spy's shoulder, shaking him and laughing. Pursue gave a firm nod. Morgause and Belzakar knocked their knuckles on the wood in greeting. "Where have you been hiding? What have you been doing all this time?" Kevin said, his voice ringing loud off the wooden ceiling. I raised my right hand, cutting the question short. The hall of a capital inn had too many ears in its walls for any answer involving our network. "Be at ease, my lord," Eldric said. His voice seemed to slide along the table, low and rasped. "The spider's little birds will not come near you while you are here. They say they are very afraid of the dark." I let out a brief laugh. "Speaking of birds, it seems you forgot to mention a detail in your reports," I said, crossing my arms. "Demonwolf." A slight smile appeared on Eldric's lips. "That is what they are calling you, my lord," the spy answered. "Your stories have been heard in every corner of Westeros. The people have not had that kind of story for a long time, and you have fallen into their favor. But Damonwolf, I said. Kevin let out a rasping laugh. What would you prefer? The poor wolf, the archer answered, scraping the porridge bowl. I shook my head slowly, tapping my fingers on the wooden table. Where is Roslyn? I asked. In the Reach. She traveled to open a branch of the cosmetics shop before the King's Raven could reach the walls of the north, Eldrick reported. She would be here if she had known of your arrival. I nodded, processing the movement. The Reach concentrated the gold of the great houses. It was the perfect ground for her business. You have not yet been properly introduced to our vanguard, I said, gesturing toward the beasts on the floor. Eldrick, these are Fenrir and Hela. Eldrick looked down. He assessed Fenrir's dense muscle and the lethal curve of Hela's exposed fangs in complete silence. The Shadowcat blinked her yellow eyes in his direction, her tail whipping the wood once. The spy lowered his hand slowly, keeping his palm open near the floor. Fenrir stretched his neck and sniffed Eldrick's cold skin, releasing a warm breath through his nostrils. Hela pressed her black nose against the man's knuckles. Eldrick ran his hand through the wolf's thick coat and then scratched lightly at the base of the Shadowcat's neck. The gold flows, the spy continued, bringing his eyes back to me and resting his elbows on the table. Roslyn's talent for multiplying coin fills new coffers every week. We have invested in shipyards, lands, and workshops, and the returns keep growing. In the free cities, gold like that buys armies, Morgoth cut in, chewing a piece of bread. The Esso's drawl cut through the morning air. Here it buys perfumes and stones. I prefer the utility of armies. The spear on your back already does the work of an entire company, Morgoth, Belzakar replied, driving his knife into the tip of a hard cheese. But he has a point. Coin overflowing the chest draws thieves. Too much comfort dulls the guard. Only the guard of someone who does not know the weight of their own blade. Pursue shot back, knocking his cup back onto the table. Pursue leaned his thick torso toward the spy, crossing his arms on the table. Changing the subject, Eldrick. What do you think those two are doing right now? Sigurd and Astrid. Killing, Kevin, Morgoth, and Belzakar answered in unison, without blinking. Eldrick confirmed with a slow nod. The spy pulled a map of the region and began to relay the Brotherhood's movements. The information matched the barkeep's parchments from White Harbor with surgical precision. Then he described the features of the person who would meet us that same morning. A sharp, clipped sound cut through the noise of the hall. It sounded like a bird's whistle from the street. Eldrick stopped mid-sentence and rose from the chair in a single movement. It is time for me to go. You are about to receive your guest, Eldrick said, pulling the black hood back over his head. I will meet you again when the meeting is finished. I have matters I need to discuss with you alone, Arthur. As do I said, nodding. Eldrick turned his back and walked toward the rear of the inn, blending into the shadows of the oak beams. He disappeared from sight long before reaching the kitchen door. He frightens me even more than before, Kevin muttered, rubbing the back of his neck under the leather. The heavy front doors of the inn opened with the crash of heavy hinges. A man crossed the threshold. The plates of his armor reflected the cold flashes of firelight like polished ice. A heavy white cloak fell across the smooth metal chest, fixed at the shoulders by darkened silver clasps. The white fabric at the edges showed thin streaks of road dust and smoke. The helm announced the knight's name. Two small black bat wings, forged in dark metal, rose from the sides of the narrow visor. It was not a piece assembled for tournament display. It was equipment designed for killing. 3 City Watch members in gold cloaks dirty at the hem marched just behind him. The knight's eyes swept the tables, assessed the sword on Pursue's back, the beasts on the floor, and locked on the scar across my face. He walked in a straight line toward our corner. Arthur Snow, I presume? The man asked, his voice coming out muffled and metallic from behind the visor's slot. I set my hands on my knees and rose from the wooden bench. I straightened the vertebrae of my spine. The top of the winged helm struck at the exact height of my lower collarbone. My shadow fell across the white plates. Esser Oswell went, I presume, I answered, looking down at him. Chapter 37 The Prince. The very same, the knight answered, his voice still carrying the metallic echo of the helm. The visor's metal creaked as Esser Oswell pushed it up with his steel gauntlet. The revealed face showed deep expression lines and sun-punished skin. The Kingsguard's dark eyes assessed the width of my shoulders, but he did not retreat a single centimeter beneath my shadow. I grabbed Pursue's forearm before the silence in the hall could stretch further. Take everyone to my room, I said low, close to his ear. Fenrir, Hela, and all our heavy equipment. Lock the door. Eldric's shadows may be nearby, but I am not leaving anything to chance. Pursue turned his body. With a tilt of his head, he guided Kevin and the Lancers toward the staircase. The wolf's and Shadowcat's paws scraped across the oak planks following the group. I waited standing, my gaze crossing with the Kingsguard's pupils. The staircase wood cracked under heavy boots minutes later. The four returned with their hands free of packs and long weapons. I kept only the sword Truth and the Valyrian steel dagger on my belt. We pushed through the inn's doors. The morning light cut through the thick street mist. The smell of old urine and rotten fish replaced the warm oat smell. Esser Oswell was already mounted on a muscular black courser. The 3 gold cloaks held the reins of their mounts one step behind. 5 riding horses knocked their hooves in the mud puddles of the pavement, tied to a splintered wooden post. "The prince provided these mounts for you," Went said from the saddle. "To help with the road to the Brotherhood." I walked toward the pavement. A roan stallion pulled at the rope tied to the post, shaking his neck frantically against the leather. White foam stained the corner of the animal's mouth. His nostrils flared with each hard pull, and his hooves crushed the mud. I stopped in front of the sweating muzzle. I raised my right hand and spread my fingers flat against the stallion's hot, wet forehead. I closed my eyes. The horse's breathing lost its desperate rhythm. The thick muscles of his neck eased under my palm. The animal stopped fighting the dirty rope and lowered his head, blowing warm air against my wrist. Went's saddle leather creaked. I opened my eyes and found the knight with his gloves locked on the reins and his lips slightly parted. His black courser took an uneasy step backward. I untied the rope from the post and mounted. Pursue, Kevin, and the Lancers released the other ties and swung into the saddles. Esser Oswell blinked, breaking the rigid set of his face. A crooked smile drew itself across the Kingsguard's dry mouth. "If you have that gift for calming hysterical beasts with a touch, save it for the Kingswood," Went said, adjusting his posture in the leather. "They say the smiling knight could use a good night's sleep." Pursue pulled his own horse's reins. He leaned his thick body toward our side. "Wonderful. Another Kevin," Pursue muttered, his heavy voice sinking into his own beard. The ride followed in silence for most of the way. The hooves struck the uneven stones of King's Landing streets. The path moved with only the sound of steel armor creaking and cold wind pushing through the alleys. Kevin drew his mount level with Esser Oswell's black courser. The archer tried to start a conversation about the weather in the capital. Went answered in short syllables, without moving his face, keeping his eyes fixed on the road just ahead. The Kingsguard gave no opening for the conversation to flow. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck under his leather, turned his face to the house walls, and pulled the reins, pulling his horse back into the middle of the formation. Pursue let out a low laugh at the back of his throat. We pushed through several more alleys until the sound of commerce disappeared entirely. A crowd of commoners blocked the square ahead. Hundreds of bodies packed in rags formed a dense mass. The silence in the air was absolute. The sound of plucked strings floated above the grimy heads. In the center of the square, planks rested on oak barrels, forming a makeshift stage. A man sat at the center of the structure. The long, smooth hair, in the silver-gold tone characteristic of House Targaryen, reflected the morning light. His eyes held a dark indigo coloring and drifted across the horizon, carrying a heavy, melancholic distance. He was tall. His long, refined fingers moved across the strings of a harp, more like the hands of an artist than a warrior. 2 men wearing the same white plates and helms as Esser Oswell stood guard at the ends of the planks. The singular appearance left no room for doubt. The crown prince and future groom, Rickard Targaryen, was playing for the commoners in the streets. The melody filled the space between the stones. Music had consumed a significant part of my years in the Elysian fields, alongside painting and sculpture. The taste for art becomes inevitable when you share existence with minds like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Van Gogh, and Rembrandt. Living alongside Mozart, Beethoven, and Bach had tuned my hearing in a permanent way. Rhaegar played with the precision of a dedicated musician, but the sound exposed the gaps where his movements could still improve. Perhaps no one else in that square noticed the timing errors, but my ears caught them. When our horses rounded the edge of the crowd, the music ended. Rhaegar noticed our approach from the corner of his eye but turned his face to the audience and dipped his head in thanks. The commoners erupted in applause and shouted praise toward the planks. The prince opened a smile for the mass. Esser Oswell pulled his reins and stepped down from the saddle. I dismounted from the stallion and threw the rope over the leather. The rest of the group did the same. We moved behind the Kingsguard, pushing through the wall of people with our shoulders. Went stopped beside the makeshift stage and waited for the prince to put away the wooden harp. The 2 white knights beside the prince in dozens of gold cloaks formed a solid wall of steel in the square. Rhaegar came down from the planks and walked in our direction. The smile stayed on his face. "Come, let us have lunch," the prince said. "I have reserved a private room." We followed Rhaegar through the streets, flanked by his white-cloaked shadows. We entered a 2-story establishment with a clean masonry facade. A woman guided the group down a stone corridor to a set of double oak doors. The interior of the room displayed dark wood-paneled walls and a long rectangular table covered by an impeccable white linen cloth. Crystal cups reflected the light of a ceiling chandelier. Went and another guard entered alongside the prince. Rhaegar took the main chair. The 2 knights positioned themselves behind him, hands resting easy on the pommels of their swords. When I lifted my boot to cross the threshold, the guard at the door raised his steel gauntlet and blocked the passage. "I ask that you leave all your weapons outside," the man said. His voice reverberated inside the white-scaled helmet. "Be at ease, Luwin," Rhaegar's voice came from inside the room. "They may keep their weapons." Sir Luwin hesitated. His eyes locked on the hilt of the sword Truth and the handle of the Valyrian steel dagger fixed to my belt, then dropped to the short blades on the others. He lowered his arm slowly and opened space. "Come, sit down," Rhaegar said. We pulled the chairs and sat along the sides of the long table. We waited for the prince to begin. "What would you like to eat?" "I personally recommend the roasted swan and a wine from the golden tree," the prince said. "We will follow your suggestion, my prince," I answered. "Excellent. Luwin, my friend, please call the attendant," Rhaegar instructed. The door opened seconds later. The attendant came in, making a deep bow for the prince, and wrote the orders in silence before disappearing into the corridor. "So, gentlemen, on behalf of the crown, I thank you for answering my father's request," the prince began, crossing his hands on the white cloth. "These bandits of the Brotherhood have been causing the council great headaches. My father, when he learned of your deeds in the north, asked to call for you. No thanks needed, my prince. The north is loyal to your family," I said. "Indeed," Rhaegar nodded. "I would venture to say it is probably the most loyal family we Targaryens have. Since your ancestor Torrhen Stark, they have never rebelled or caused any kind of conflict. Quite the contrary, they have always answered the crown's requests. Because of that, on behalf of House Targaryen, I thank House Stark and all the loyal houses of the north." I held the response for a moment before answering. "Even though I am a bastard, your grace, on behalf of House Stark, my father, and all the north, I thank you for your words," I said. "Do not speak of bastards as if they were lesser beings, Arthur." "I can call you that, can I not?" the prince replied. "My future wife and the man you met outside the door are Dornish. And in Dorne, who your parents slept with, says absolutely nothing about a person's character." Rhaegar let out a slow breath, his gaze pulling back for a fraction of a second. "I would like the entire kingdom to follow that thinking. Unfortunately, it is not possible. It is already too deeply rooted in everyone's head." "Oh, my manners," the prince continued, gesturing toward the 2 figures behind him. "Let me introduce them. You have already met Sir Oswell Went here. I do not know if you have had the pleasure of hearing him, but he has a peculiar sense of humor." Went did not move a muscle. "And this is the famous Sir Arthur Dane. Come, Arthur, remove your helm." The knight brought his hands to his head and removed the piece of steel. Sir Arthur had pale skin, hair in a shade that shifted between pale gold and dark, and intense violet eyes. His face showed hard, striking features. His shoulders were wide and dense. His height sat close to 6'3", slightly shorter than me. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Sir Arthur," I said, extending my right hand across the table. Dane nodded. The sword of the morning's calloused fingers gripped mine in a firm greeting. "The pleasure is mine. Sir Arthur has been curious about your swordsmanship," Rhaegar remarked, the smile climbing his cheeks. "He grows melancholy at Dragonstone because he cannot find anyone fit to face him in single combat. Sir Barristan is actually the closest anyone comes to forcing him to use both hands, but it is still not enough. Perhaps you could be the first to beat the sword of the morning." "It will be a pleasure, your grace," I said, tilting my head slightly toward Dane. I returned my hand to the table. "Allow me to introduce my line. This is Kevin, one of the finest archers you will ever meet, but a presumptuous fool." "Hey," Kevin cut in, leaning his torso forward. "Do not believe him, your grace. I am a cultured and humble person. It is a pleasure to meet you all." Rhaegar and the two Kingsguard behind his chair let out quick laughs. This is Pursue, I continued. An excellent fighter and one of the most principled men I know. Sirs, your grace, it is a pleasure to meet you. Pursue's heavy voice filled the room as he dipped his head. Rhaegar, Arthur, and Went nodded to the shield warrior. And these are Belzacar and Morgause, former Unsullied, and my family, I finished. The two lancers bent their necks in silence. Rhaegar's breath caught for a moment. Arthur and Went narrowed their eyes. The look of Essos was obvious, but the training and title of the Unsullied carried brutal weight in Westeros. Before any misunderstanding arises, my mother purchased them in Volantis and freed them immediately after, I said, cutting the unspoken theories short. But they chose to continue following her of their own will. Of course, Rhaegar agreed, the tension leaving his shoulders. If there is anyone who would not resort to slaves, it is the Northerners. The North's repugnance for slavery is known across all of Westeros. The doors swung open. The attendant and other servants entered carrying heavy iron trays with roasted swan and jugs of wine. Just in time, Rhaegar said, rubbing his hands together to break the weight of the last exchange. I am starving. Plates and cups circulated across the wood. During the meal, Rhaegar poured questions about the cold wind beyond the wall. He asked about Fenrir's size and Hela's coat, declaring he would pay a visit to the inn to meet them before we rode back through the city gates toward the north. When the swan bones were dropped on the iron plates, Rhaegar drained his crystal cup and rested his arms on the white cloth. So, Arthur, the prince's tone cut through the banquet air. You and your wolfpack need to neutralize this Kingswood Brotherhood. They have been causing problems for a long time. It was something periodic. They robbed merchants, carts and asked low ransoms for a few minor lords. But with my wedding approaching, they have been attacking with greater violence and frequency on the southern roads. The prince held his gaze on my scar. For your deeds in the north, hunting bandits, rapists, and savage tribes, we believe you are the most qualified men for this bloody work. The crown will pay 5,000 gold dragons for their elimination, and you will have authority to execute them. Rhaegar leaned back in the chair. And, on my personal account, I offer you custom weapons and armor, forged by the finest blacksmith in King's Landing, Tobo Mott. I thank you for the generosity, my prince, I answered, tilting the crystal cup slightly. Rhaegar shook his head. He released the glass stem and placed both forearms on the white linen cloth, closing the distance across the table. The indigo eyes locked on my face, steady, not sliding toward the scar or the weapons at my belt. It is the limit of what I can offer at the moment. I am still only the heir. His voice dropped a tone, sounding denser inside the closed room. On the day I am king, I promise to compensate the North for all these years of the crown's neglect. Setting aside the barren rocks of the Iron Islands, no other kingdom has been as forgotten by the Council's policies as yours. I intend to change that in a definitive way. The Crown Prince set his hands on the edge of the table and pushed his chair back. The wood scraped on the floor, making Esser Arthur and Esser Oswell straighten their postures almost at the same time. Well, it has been a true pleasure meeting all of you. I hope you enjoyed the food, Rhaegar said, arranging the dark fabric of his cloak over his shoulders. I must be going now, as I have a wedding to prepare for. If you will excuse me. We pressed our boots to the floor and rose together. Morgause and Belzacar dipped their heads. The swan was very good, your grace. Better than the dried meat on the road, Kevin said. I hope we can meet again before you leave for the north, Rhaegar continued, opening a measured smile. I still have to meet Fenrir and Hela. And incidentally, if you would like to stay for my wedding, it would be an honor to have you there. I looked at the prince's face, keeping the polished tone that the sigil in the room demanded. It will be a pleasure to introduce them to you, my lord, I said. As for the wedding, if the hunt goes well and we return in time, we may be able to attend. Excellent, Rhaegar said, moving toward the oak door. You can put Tobo Mott's expenses in my name and I will settle the amounts directly with him later. When do you plan to go after them? Soon, I answered, keeping my eyes on the Targaryen's face. Within the next few days. Very well. When you return, come find me, Rhaegar said. Esser Luwin opened the double corridor doors. Until then, gentlemen. The five of us dipped. The three white cloaks followed the princes back out of the room. The heavy wood closed on its hinges, locking the sound of the escort outside. That was interesting. Who would have thought the prince would be so reasonable, Kevin said, as the group reached the cobbled pavement of the street. Must have inherited it from his mother, Pursue murmured. Short laughs scraped through throats and followed the sound of leather boots. "Let us get back to the rooms and prepare," I said, adjusting the sword belt. "I want to finish this as fast as possible." "Agreed," Morgause replied. Belzakar, Pursue, and Kevin confirmed with short nods. The group moved toward the foot of Vyzenia's hill. Kevin kicked a loose stone into the gutter, throwing up black splashes. "This city makes me sick," the archer muttered, covering his nose with the side of his hand. The return journey demanded less physical effort than the crossing with Varys, but the capital's air kept its usual weight. We pushed through the double doors of the Crown of Flowers. The lower hall reeked of pork and sweat. We crossed the wooden boards, climbed the oak staircase, and stopped in the corridor. I turned the iron handle of my room. Eldrick was sitting on the edge of my bed. The spy's hand rested on top of Fenrir's head, scratching through the wolf's thick coat. Hela slept curled on the wool rug, the tip of her black tail tapping slowly on the floorboards. "I knew you had the gift," I said, closing the door with a click. The corner of my mouth pulled up. "Gift? For what, my lord?" Eldrick asked, without breaking the rhythm of his fingers on the beast's ears. "I met some people who guided me along the path of the Greensight." "I see that trace in you," I answered, dropping the sword belt on the table. "Perhaps less than in me. The connection is still there. Just by the way Fenrir is comfortable in your presence, it is already a sign of it. He is a selective boy." Eldrick stilled his hand. The man's dark eyes found mine. "You are speaking of the children of the forest." I leaned forward. "Exactly. How did you know?" "There is an old legend circulating among my people," Eldrick said, his hoarse voice sliding through the closed room. "In the God's Eye, near those ruins of Harrenhal, the old magic did not die. They say green seers and the children of the forest themselves live hidden on that island to this day." "The God's Eye, I have heard of it. I read records in some books at Winterfell, and Leaf told me something about it," I said. "The land there is heavier than any maester's book can carry, my lord. The pact between the children and the first men was forged on that soil. That is where they created the sacred order of the Green Men to protect the island and the wood," Eldrick explained. "They did an absolute job of it. Not even the fleets and steel of the Andals managed to break the waters and conquer that piece of land. Kings and conquerors bled trying to set foot on that soil packed with weirwoods." "Interesting," I murmured. "It seems I will have to investigate that lake more closely in the future." I rested my arms on my legs, leaning forward. Setting the God's Eye aside, I said, "Tell me, what did you want to discuss before you disappeared?" "You asked me to map men across the continent. People with rare abilities and qualities that could strengthen our network before I move on," Eldrick said. The spy reached under his cloak and pulled out a thick parchment. "I found names that may interest you." "Tell me, then, my friend." Eldrick unfolded the paper against his leg. "One of my shadows sent direct reports from the Citadel," the spy began. "A man called Qyburn, an absolute genius in the art of healing. The maesters whisper that his hands surpass even those of Archmaester Ebros. But his curiosity broke its chains." Eldrick raised his eyes. "He seeks to swallow the Archmaester's knowledge whole. Instead of opening corpses to study the dead and disease, as the Citadel has done for centuries, Qyburn began opening living bodies. Condemned men rotting in dungeons and the sick in their final breaths. He wants to tear out the secrets of death while the subject's heart still beats." I rested my elbow on the arm of the chair. The thread beyond the wall did not bleed from the cut of a common sword. A man who carved at the exact boundary between life and necromancy with sharp steel for what was coming. "His practices brought him before the Citadel's tribunal," Eldrick continued. "I received word that he has just been expelled and had his chain stripped from his neck by the Archmaesters, judged for unethical practices. But he himself claims to understand more about the secrets of life and death than any man breathing in the Seven Kingdoms." "Qyburn," I repeated the name slowly. "You have convinced me. Bring him to our side." Eldrick gave a short nod and brought his eyes back to the parchment. "Another man, the younger brother of the infamous mountain," he continued. "They say that as a child, Sandor Clegane suffered monstrous facial burns. Gregor pushed the boy's face against a lit brazier simply because Sandor had taken a toy of his. There are strong rumors that a sister and their father were also massacred by Gregor. But since the mountain is one of Tywin Lannister's most useful and brutal dogs, the graves were sealed in silence." Fenrir snorted through his nostrils and dropped his heavy head onto the mattress. The boy's contempt for the shining farce of knighthood was cemented by an episode at a tournament in Lannisport, the spy explained. "Rhaegar was there. The prince was stunned when he saw Gregor's physical size and brutality with a sword in the sand. He knighted him on the spot, ignoring the shadows of his past. Later, Rhaegar discovered the blood on the mountain's hands and bitterly regretted it. The sword had already touched the man's shoulders. Eldrick folded the edge of the paper. Sandor came to despise fire, his blood brother, and every hypocrisy of knighthood. He is a man broken by the world. Pure hatred for the mountain is the only thing that moves him. If you can put a collar on him, he will be a brutal asset, Eldrick said. He carries the brother's genes. A massive build, pushing 2 meters in height, and violent skill with steel. Good. Bring him too, I said. The spy gave a brief nod. A shallow smile cut across his dry lips. Is there anyone else? I asked. Ah, yes, I saved the best for last, Eldrick answered. And he is anchored here, in King's Landing, at this exact moment. Tell me more. Davos, Eldrick said, the words flowing faster. Born right here, in the mud of Flea Bottom. In his youth, he served on the deck of the Cobblecat, under the command of a smuggler and pirate from Tyrosh called Roro Uhoris. The captain's luck ran out when the Night's Watch patrol cornered him near Eastwatch. The crows took Uhoris's head for selling weapons to the wildlings. Despite watching the ice stain with blood, Davos did not flinch. He kept dealing with the Black Cloaks after that. Eldrick smoothed the crumpled parchment against the fabric of his trousers. After the end of the Cobblecat, Davos carved his own salt path. He got his hands on a small, fast ship. Today he is one of the most notorious smugglers cutting the seas of the Seven Kingdoms. He guides his black-sailed ship into commercial ports in the dead of night and has a talent for navigating shallow, treacherous waters where large hulls break apart. The Three Sisters have seen him many times. And White Harbor's waters have swallowed his anchors dozens of times. Davos demanded more effort to track, Eldrick continued, rolling the parchment between his fingers. Beyond operating in absolute silence, he has a natural ability to earn the respect of people on the docks. He is a man of his word, straight and loyal. I would venture to say he handles a tiller with more skill than most Ironborn captains. He married a woman called Maria. Their first child was born last year. I shook my head slowly. You can be frightening, Eldrick, I said, watching the paper disappear into the folds of the black cloak. The level of information you pull from the ground is extraordinary. That is my true gift, the spy answered, raising his face from the half-light of the room. And you gave me the structure to sharpen it. I am grateful to have a clear target to aim at. I got up from the chair. I crossed 2 steps, stopping beside the bed, and rested my hand on Eldrick's shoulder, pressing the thick wool of his cloak. You are family, Eldrick, I said. Never forget that. Chapter 38 Eldrick, Tobo, Kingswood. You are part of our family, Eldrick, I said. Never forget that. Thank you, my lord. I won't forget, Eldrick replied. I pulled my hand back and nodded. The corner of my lips curved upward. What else do you have to tell me? I asked. Eldrick tucked the crumpled parchment into the inner pockets of his black cloak. He rested his palms on his thighs and leaned his thick torso toward me. His tone dropped, blending with the street noise outside the window. In our own backyard, Eldrick said. The Dreadfort, Roose Bolton. I rested my elbow on my leg. The Lord continues flaying in the dark, the spy continued. My shadows in the castle saw the remains. They found strips of damp skin stretched over wooden frames in the deepest dungeons. He flays criminals. Some peasants who vanished in recent moons ended up tied to those same tables. The old ways, I muttered. All of them, Eldrick confirmed, his gaze locked on my face. Roose still practices the first night. The isolated villages in the Bolton lands pay the price in silence. His men drag the women from their homes on their wedding day and return them the next morning, their tongues tied by fear. Fenrir raised his right ear on the mattress, listening to the scraping of Hela's paws on the floorboards, before burying his snout back into his own paws. There's more, Eldrick said. Remember the abrupt rise in banditry on the dirt roads of the north before the pack cleared the routes. Roose had his hand in those fires. He allowed the camps. The Lord facilitated the scum's movement through his own borders. The goal was to bleed the trade routes and test Winterfell's grip, taking advantage of the chaos. I squeezed my fingers against the leather of my pants, feeling the hardness of bone beneath the fabric. When we decimated the camps and hung the bodies from the trees, the news spread across the north fast, I said. And reached the Dreadfort, Eldrick pointed out. In the Great Hall, before his own captains, Roose's reaction was a pale, silent approval. The same mask of ice as always. One of my shadows works in the corridor of the Lord's chambers. Eldrick ran his thumb over his own knuckles. Roos locked himself in his room that night. Silence dominated the corridor. The spy reported. The maester was called 3 times before dawn, carrying glass jars filled with fat leeches. The Lord demanded to be bled far beyond the usual. The brass basins the servants carried out of the room smelled of iron and overflowed with black water and dead bugs. Eldrick narrowed his eyes. The carnage your pack left on the roads crushed the web of disorder he fed behind your house's back. The Lord drained his own blood until his skin turned ashen. The mask needed to stay intact in front of the captains. Gather every scroll and record you can against Roose Bolton, I ordered. When I cross the gates of Winterfell, I will throw this proof on my father's table. I could infiltrate a shadow into the Dreadfort and slit the Lord's throat. The maester would just find his body in the morning, drowned in his own blood by the leeches. The job would take one night. I stopped, breathing in the stale air of the room. I demand the banners of the North planted in the mud of the Dreadfort. The lords of the other houses will watch the end of the Winter King's enemy lineage in the light of day. I rested my forearms on my knees. The North has forgotten the weight of the direwolf, I said. The lords of the South and the Snows think House Stark lost its fangs when Torrhen knelt on the scorched earth to spare the North from Aegon's fire. Winterfell's shadow has shrunk in these past years. My father's silence sounds like passivity. I leaned my back against the wooden chair. I will remind these castle lords of the taste of the Winter King's blood. My lineage's name carries snow. I will never sit in the main chair of the Great Hall. It matters little. No one will mock the stone that raised my father and my brothers. My sword exists only to forge a wall of steel around my family. My own hands will rip the Boltons out by the root. So it shall be, my lord, Eldrick replied. The corner of the spy's mouth twitched. On the mattress, Fenrir released a low, torn growl from the back of his throat. The thick black fur on the wolf's neck bristled against the blanket's fabric. I pushed the chair back and stood up. The wood scraped against the floorboards. I walked to the room's small window. The noise of wagon wheels and the muffled shouts of merchants in the street hit the dust-stained glass. I'm proud of what you and Rosalind have built, I said, watching the capital's movement down below. The reflection in the darkened glass threw back the outline of my smile. You two raised an entire empire in your roles. I turned my body. Eldrick was also standing beside the bed. Rosalind sent her regards before taking the road to the Reach, Eldrick said, adjusting the weight of the black cloak over his shoulders. She went to sign the papers for the cosmetics shop's new branch. Did she travel alone? Razdan accompanies her, the spy replied, crossing his gloved hands in front of his body. That eunuch doesn't take his eyes off her when there are coins involved in the deal. I nodded. Before Astrid and Sigurd left, I did something with them that I will do with you now, I continued, walking slowly away from the window. Ever since the coats Rosalind sewed, the idea finally took shape. I created an organization, a clan, a family with a closed structure. I baptized it Yggdrasil. Eldrick's dark eyes followed my movement across the room. Just like in the old legend I told you in the courtyard years ago, each branch of this tree sustains a different force, I said. Each branch demands a leader to command their respective groups. You coordinate our web of shadows. Yes, Eldrick replied. His hoarse voice sounded flat and dry. I stopped an arm's length away from the spy. I made Sigurd the commander of Jotunheim, leading our front line. Astrid took over Niflheim. I pulled truth from its scabbard. The friction of the Valyrian steel hissed against the leather. Kneel, Eldrick, Lord of Helheim. Eldrick bent his leg. His right knee hit the floorboards with a hollow sound. I tilted the dark, smoky blade until the metal weighed on the wool of his left shoulder. Your domain is Helheim. I lowered the tone of my voice. The words scraped in the short air between us. The hidden realm beneath the tree's roots. The place where the forgotten, the condemned, and the dead without a song go. In the old stories, the terror of kings came from invisible men. Those who walked through walls, stole secrets through stone, and brought death before fear had time to be born. Fenrir's heavy breathing crackled against the mattress covers behind us. Helheim dispenses with banners and glory. The other realms of Yggdrasil will attract the light. Your arm will operate in the flesh, I continued, tightening my fingers on the dragonbone hilt. Before this tree, do you swear to abandon your own name, pride, and recognition to become the earth beneath our roots? Swear to track conspiracies before the whispers, break traitors before they raise their hands, and silently slaughter anyone who threatens our home? Do you swear to swallow the dark to keep the others in the light, planting a faceless fear in the chests of kings. The wind forced the wooden frame of the window. Eldrick raised his chin, his opaque, dark eyes fixed on the steel stretched between us. Shadows lose their use under the light. His tone came out flat, driving into the silence of the room. Our function is to remain when it vanishes. I will listen, I will find. When Helheim comes for our enemies, they will understand too late. I swear. I raised truth, removing the weight of the steel from his shoulder. May your footsteps never leave tracks and your presence never announce death before its time, I said, holding the blade in the air. May your eyes see through lies, and may fear walk silently ahead of your shadows. I consecrate you as Helheim, the invisible darkness beneath our tree's roots. Rise, brother. I sank the sword back into its scabbard with a sharp click. I extended my forearm. Eldrick pressed his hand flat against my leather glove and pulled his body up. Gather the three of them, I said, leaning my hip against the edge of the oak table. We leave for the Street of Steel now. Tobo Mott has equipment waiting for us at the forge. Then, the Kingswood. Eldrick's hand locked before touching the iron doorknob. He twisted his neck back toward the room. Tobo Mott, Eldrick repeated, the sound chewed in the back of his throat. He was the next name on my list. I crossed my arms. Why, he is a master from Qohor. One of the few in the known world capable of reworking Valyrian steel, the spy explained. Reworking. The original method was lost, wasn't it? Eldrick nodded. The secret of the ancient forge turned to ash along with the doom. The Qohoric smiths retained the art of melting and molding old steel into new blades, preserving the metal's properties. I slid my hand to Truth's dragonbone pommel. Having the loyalty of a man with that level of understanding of rare metals was a raw piece on the board. Useful, I muttered. How do I bring him? Mott worships the anvil, Eldrick replied, letting go of the doorknob for a moment. Gold and the crown's coffers buy his time. Knowledge buys the man. The smithy is the Qohoric's life. Put a method, a fold, or a design his eyes don't know in front of him. He will bow to learn. Understood, I said, driving the information into my memory. May the shadows hide your steps, brother. Eldrick pulled the black hood over his hair, nodded once, and slipped outside. The door closed with a soft metallic click in the corridor. I grabbed the leather belt off the table and buckled Truth and the dagger to my waist. Fenrir jumped off the mattress, and Hela stretched her long body on the rug. I opened the door and went down the stairs. The inn's common room stank of warm ale and old meat stew. Perseus, Kevin, Belzakar, and Morgause waited, leaning against the tables near the exit door. Let's go, I ordered, passing by them. Street of Steel. We left the inn and the heat of the street hit our faces. The path to the base of Vysenya's hill required clearing space between wooden wagons and merchants. The smell of saltwater from the river mixed with the garbage piled in the corners of the alleys. The leveled pavement gave way to the irregular stones of the slope. We entered the Street of Steel. At the base of the hill, the sound was sharp and chaotic. Dozens of small hammers struck quickly against tin and copper in cramped workshops. The air smelled of fine soot. The wooden houses squeezed against each other, their roofs nearly touching. As our boots forced the climb, the street grew darker. The upper floors of the buildings projected over the stones, blocking the sunlight and forming a corridor of shadow and gray smoke. The noise of tin vanished. Heavy mallets began to crush iron and steel rhythmically, making the ground vibrate beneath the soles of our boots. Coal and sulfur smoke descended from the chimneys, sticking the soot to our clothes and pushing sweat down our necks. Heat radiated from the open doors along the climb. The size of the workshops grew with every meter advanced. At the top of the hill, Tobo Mott's smithy capped the slope. The solid wood and plaster structure crushed the size of any other building around it. The upper floors advanced far beyond the pavement, casting a dense, permanent shadow at the end of the street. The main entrance displayed double doors, one leaf carved in dark ebony and the other cut in white weirwood. The surface reproduced a hunting scene in high relief, with hounds and wolves sinking their teeth into the flanks of fierce boars. Two life-sized stone knights flanked the wood. The statues wore red armor, molded with the contours of a griffin and a unicorn, standing guard at the facade. I pushed the ebony door. A brass bell struck at the top of the frame. The sharp sound cut through the street noise. The internal environment blocked the smoke from outside. The heat, however, radiated from the back of the hall, where furnaces roared. A woman walked toward us. She wore a well-cut dark linen dress, keeping her clean hands crossed in front of her body. "Hello, Tobo Mott's shop," the woman said. How may we help you? I am Arthur Snow, I said. Prince Rhaegar sent word that we would be coming here. Perfectly, Lord Snow. Follow me. She guided us to the center of the hall. The temperature rose against the skin. Tobo Mott punished an incandescent iron block on a massive anvil with a long-handled mallet. Orange sparks sprayed and died against the black leather apron covering his broad body. The master smith finished the strike, dropped the heavy tool, and dismissed the attendant with a short wave of his free hand. Prince Rhaegar will pay. Mott's voice sounded thick, carrying the heavy accent of the free cities. Clean swords, full armors, something custom. You can choose whatever you want. As he spoke, the smith's eyes swept the group. His gaze stopped at my waist. His pupils locked onto the sword's elongated hilt and dropped quickly to the grip of the dagger secured in the leather of my doublet. He kept his attention on the metal for a second longer before turning his face to Perseus. Our northern equipment was still intact. Kevin chose a new boiled leather quiver and a short-hilted dagger with an iron guard. Perseus tested the balance of a clean-cut longsword. Belzacar and Morgause grabbed thick-shafted spears and round shields with edges lined in tempered steel. I walked along the shelves and racks, letting the floorboards creak beneath my boots. I slid my fingers over the seams of the chainmail and examined the joints of the dark breastplates. The precision of the cuts and the raw polish on the plates proved the weight of the Cohoric's work. I stopped in front of a smooth helm in the darkest corner of the shop. Mott's boots sounded behind me. The smell of sweat and honing oil accompanied his approach. Those blades of yours, the smith asked in a lower tone. Would you let me see them? I turned my body. I held my gaze on the smith's wrinkled eyes for a moment. I pulled the belt buckle and handed Truth's scabbard into his hands. Mott held the black leather case. His thick fingers felt the veins of the material. He lowered his sight to the opaque blue stone embedded in the pommel and turned the hilt under the warm light of the hall. She is beautiful, he murmured. Mott pulled the guard. The friction hissed thinly. The dark Valyrian steel cut the forge's light, revealing the smoky ripples molded into the black metal. Indeed, very beautiful, Mott added. His face didn't divert from the exposed blade. It's the truth of the Rogers. Isn't it? My jaw muscle tightened. I lowered my right hand, brushing my fingertips against the hilt of the dagger attached to my doublet. The smith heard the scraping of leather. He kept the tip of the Valyrian blade lowered, pointing at the stone floor. Don't be scared, young man, Mott said, keeping his hands calm and away from his body. I come from a lineage that served the fire. Ancient slave smiths of old Valyria. Chance pulled my ancestors out before the doom swallowed the mountains. The Motts kept their roots in the free cities. We settled in Qohor and prospered in the furnaces there. We are the only ones left with the knowledge to rework Valyrian steel. Before crossing the salt water, the Qohoric's voice dropped, blending with the muffled noise of the mallets in the back of the workshop. Men tried to tear the secret from our furnaces. My father and my brother spat out their own tongues and denied them. They were getting their throats slit on top of the anvils. The priests of the Black Goat dragged my mother away. Her blood washed the altars of the temple. Mott sank his broad chest, pulling in the hall's thick air. I missed the massacre because I was working in Volantis, bending steel for the old bloods of the city. He raised his eyes from the Valyrian blade to my face. The wrinkled skin stretched at the corners of his eyes. I met a girl on those streets. The smith turned his wrist, reflecting the lanterns, light on the dark waves of the metal. She bumped into my shoulder. Bought plates of meat in a tavern near the port to cover the stumble. She talked a lot, carried the age you have now. She walked the stones of Volantis with this exact sword at her waist. Without an escort, without a cloak over the leather of the scabbard. Mott ran his thick thumb near the sword's guard. I warned her about the knives in the alleys and the price men charge for a blade like this on the black market. She just smiled, answered some foolishness about dreams and charted paths. The smith slid the darkened blade back into the black leather scabbard. The metal locked at the bottom with a sharp click. He inverted the weapon and extended the hilt with the blue stone toward me. Her name was Jaenara. My lips parted. The forge's heat dried the back of my throat. I took the scabbard from the smith's hand. The black leather weighed against the palm of my glove. I couldn't let her take that risk, Mott continued. His hand with the gold rings fell to the side of his apron. The men at the tavern tables were already craning their necks. Valyrian steel draws the eyes. The jewels of the Rogers draw blood. In Westeros, a lord would recognize Dark Sister or Blackfire on a stranger's belt. On the stones of Essos, truth carries the same weight. Any mercenary in the port would kill her before nightfall. The smith shook his large head. The lanterns, light reflected off the sweat on his forehead. She was stubborn. I tried to convince her to sell the piece or wrap the hilt in dirty rags. She refused, said the sword needed to stay with her. The only way out I found was offering a hiding place. I handed her a chest. A dark coffer my family dragged from Valyria before the mountains melted. My forging hammer traveled inside it. The long steel fit perfectly. She locked the weapon away, smiled at me, and said one day someone would repay that favor. I told her I didn't collect debts from children. Mott scratched the side of his square beard. The noise of crushed iron echoed in the back of the workshop. You must think me a fool, the smith's voice thickened. Handing relics of old Valyria to an unknown girl on the streets of Valantis. But she carried an absurd gravity. She pulled the entire air from the place. The few words we exchanged at that table changed the direction of my work. It was frightening. I tightened my fingers around the scabbard, feeling the rough relief of the dark leather. I see her trace in your face, Tobo said, his eyes measuring my features under the workshop's orange light. The same jawline, the same gravity pulling the air from the place. You are the son. Jainera died at my birth, I said, keeping my gaze straight and my voice dry. The smith rested his heavy hand on my shoulder. The heat of the thick leather passed through my doublet's fabric. The world lost a good woman, Maud murmured. He pulled his hand back and rubbed his thumb's calluses. When I returned to Qohor, my family's ashes were already cold. Essos lost its use. I gathered a few old belongings, family heirlooms we kept hidden under the stones. I crossed the narrow sea and raised these walls in King's Landing. I'm sorry for your family, I replied. Tobo Mott waved his large hand in the air, shooing away the invisible smoke of memory. Let it go, boy. Valar Morghulis. Valar Dohaeris, I muttered, lowering my chin in a short movement. I fastened Truth's leather case back to the belt under my doublet. My mother warned that someone would pay for your help, I said. The debt passed to the blood. I need to use your forge for a few days. Tobho's thick eyebrows knitted together in the center of his forehead. Do you know the work on the anvil, boy? Enough, I affirmed, closing and opening the fingers of my right hand. Mott pointed his chin toward the back of the shop. There is a furnace in the back. The apprentices use the space to fold smaller pieces. The coal is full. My thanks, I said, turning my shoulders in the direction he indicated. I walked through the shelves to where Perseus, Kevin, Belzacar, and Morgause gathered the new weapons. The work in the fire will require days, I warned. Return to the inn, lock the room door and feed Fenrir and Hela raw meat until I get back. Perseus nodded, throwing the darkened mail over his broad shoulder, and pushed the ebony door to the street. I crossed the main hall and entered the back courtyard. The heat doubled, the air stank of pure sulfur and old sweat. I went to the supply depot and pulled soft iron bars and rigid steel ingots, weighing the differences in both hands. I threw coal into the furnace and pulled the bellows. The fire roared. I placed the pieces in the center of the flames and waited. The metal reached an almost white yellow, with the edges taking on a liquid appearance. I pulled the glowing block with long-handled tongs and brought down the mallet. The impact sprayed orange sparks onto the leather apron. The initial welding consumed the daylight and the firewood of the night. The alignment required constant correction with every wrong strike. Sweat ran down my eyelashes, burning my eyes. On the second day, I started the fold. I elongated the hot block with mallet blows, marked the center with the chisel, and folded the steel mass over itself. I returned the piece to the fire. The process repeated dozens of times. With each fold, the internal layers multiplied. The sound of the hammer against the hot metal shifted from a hollow thud to a sharp ring. Blisters popped on the base of my right thumb, rubbing raw flesh on the tool's wooden handle. This stage chewed through 3 uninterrupted days, with eyes fixed on the color of the ember and the resistance of the piece. On the 5th day, the blade took shape. I struck the metal on the side of the anvil. I defined the thicker spine in the center and thinned the edges for the cutting wire. The weight transferred to the base. The irregular block assumed the contour of a weapon. The heat treatment covered the following hours. I heated the entire blade evenly. I plunged the red steel into a narrow tank of oil. The liquid hissed loudly. A cloud of black, stinking smoke rose to the ceiling. The thermal shock abruptly hardened the material's internal structure. Next, I returned the piece to tempering in weak embers, heating the metal slowly to relieve internal tension and prevent the sword from shattering on the first impact. The finishing took the last 2 days. I cleaned the soot and rubbed sand and whetstone along the surface. The opaque gray gave way to a clean shine. The internal design rose to the light. Dark and light lines formed ripples across the metal's extension, flowing through the blade like a river's murky current. The pattern of hundreds of folds exposed on the steel. I clamped the piece in the vise for the final assembly. I fitted the darkened steel guard, forged with a slight curve at the ends to protect the hands. The hammered texture broke the light on the surface. I adjusted the hardwood grip on the tang. I wrapped stretched strips of black leather in a spiral, locking the grip. I fixed the rounded, heavy pommel on the end, smooth, without marks. The weight of the weapon balanced in the palm of my hand. Soot covered my skin. Sweat rolled down my temples, washing the black dirt and running down my neck. I wrapped the entire sword in a raw cloth and left the back furnace. The rhythmic noise of crushed metal echoed in the main hall. Mott locked his mallet in the air when I crossed the stone arch. He dropped the heavy wooden handle onto the anvil and rubbed the back of his arm against his soaked forehead. "Gods, boy," finally, the smith's thick voice sounded over the hiss of the coal. "I came in with plates of food at night and you didn't even blink at the meat." I was focused, I said. My throat scratched, dry and soaked in smoke. The Kohorik's wrinkled eyes lowered to the long bundle in my hands. I walked to the polished walnut bench and set the weapon down on the wood. I took a step back. Pav Tobo Mott. I wiped the soot from my hands on the black leather apron. The boy smelled of old ashes. His chest rose and fell heavily beneath the doublet. The arm muscles trembled from the exhaustion of uninterrupted days with the hammer. I approached the counter. My thick fingers touched the darkened steel guard that escaped the tip of the fabric. The metal retained a remainder of heat. The steel's curvature elongated functionally, protecting the joints without compromising balance. I slid my thumb over the stretched leather rings on the hilt and squeezed the smooth, rounded pommel. No burr hit the skin. No unevenness ruined the grip. The firm assembly would absorb the brutal shock against iron plates without passing the vibration to the wrist bones. The work carried the hand of a master. I pulled the tip of the raw cloth, revealing the first span of the weapon. The air failed in my throat. I slid the fabric to the base of the table, stripping the entire blade bare. The steel shined clean, polished, and lethal under the workshop's light. Fine lines, alternating dark and light tones, flowed through the metal's extension. The folds formed intricate ripples, running from the base to the sharp tip, reproducing stagnant smoke in shallow rivers. The contorted pattern filled every inch of the sword. I passed the callus of my thick finger over the cold side of the weapon. "What is this, boy?" I asked. The sound of the anvil faded in the hall. The design reproduces the waves of old Valyria. The color and texture of the metal give away a distant origin. The forging diverges. Arthur Snow narrowed his red, smoke-irritated eyes on the other side of the bench. "Pav Arthur Snow." I took back my air. My throat scratched, dry and thick with soot. "A continuous fold," I said. "A mixture of rigid steel and soft iron. The block is stretched in the heat, cut in the center, and folded over itself dozens of times. The union of the two metals creates the flexibility for the blade not to break on impact and the hardness to sustain the cut." The Kohorik tilted his face over the bench. His heavy breath fogged a patch of the polished metal. "The wave pattern is the scar of the folds," I added. The popped blisters at the base of my thumb burned in contact with the air. The thermal shock of the oil in the cooling darkens the rigid layers and exposes the light iron. Mott slid the tip of his right thumb over the sword's edge. The movement was slow and light. A thin line of blood sprouted on the thick, calloused skin immediately. The smith stopped, raising his hand and staring at the red running down the contour of his finger. "You didn't use ancient spells," Mott murmured. His voice sounded hollowed out. "No dragon fire. Pure hammer and temperature control. Your people master the melting and reworking of ancient blades," I said, leaning my hip against the edge of the wood. "You depend on the steel that survived the doom. I brought a primary forge. A method to create lethal blades using only raw material and your anvil." Silence weighed in the hall. The noise of the fire seemed distant. Mott pressed his wounded thumb against his index finger. The gold rings struck against the bench when he flattened both hands on the table. "What do you demand for this method, boy?" the smith asked. The tame posture of a merchant vanished. "Your anvil," I replied. "You will learn the temperatures, the limit of the folds, and the exact time of tempering. In exchange, this steel will forge only for my band. No piece with this design will cross the ebony doors into the hands of the southern lords." The smith looked at the blade on the table. He pulled a cotton rag from his apron and wrapped the fabric around the cut finger. "My hammers fold steel for the north," Mott drove his dark pupils into my face. "We have an agreement." I have some pending matters in the north to resolve, I said. When things are ready, a raven will fly to King's Landing with the call. Tobo nodded, his chin vanishing into his square beard. The anvil will be waiting. The blade stays with you, I said, pushing the forged sword across the bench toward him. It is the first part of the payment for my mother's debt. The folding method comes later. Tobo extended his thick hand and squeezed mine. The calluses scratched the leather of my glove. I crossed the ebony doors and walked down the slope of the street of steel. The sun was setting, darkening the alleys. I returned to the inn and went straight up to the room. I turned the key in the lock. Fenrir and Hela rose from the rugs and advanced toward me. The thick smell of soot and sulfur hit the beasts' snouts. The direwolf sneezed, shook his head, and turned around, sinking into the mattress. Hela hissed low and retreated to the corner of the wall. I filled the wooden tub in the corner of the room. The water cooled fast. I scrubbed the ash soap until the black water washed the dirt from my pores. I stepped out of the tub, put on clean pants, and collapsed on the bed. Exhaustion crushed my consciousness. I woke up with the daylight crossing the window. I went down to the main hall. Perseus, Kevin, Morgause, and Belzacar were tearing pieces of bread and pork at a table near the unlit fireplace. Grab your equipment, I said, stopping beside the table. Kingswood, we leave now. The four wiped their hands and stood up. Fenrir and Hela came down the stairs soon after, sniffing the smell of food in the air. We went to the stables in the back of the inn and saddled the 5 warhorses Prince Rhaegar had left for the group. The ride to the borders of the capital was fast. We crossed the city gates and took the Kingsroad heading south. The density of the Kingswood swallowed the horses shortly after noon. The smell of garbage and sewage from King's Landing vanished, replaced by the aroma of damp earth, pines, and decaying leaves. I pulled my horse's reins. I unfolded Eldric's parchment over the saddle's leather. The map marked general land elevations in the course of a drying stream, but the markings were old. I dismounted the saddle. I leaned my back against the wide trunk of an ancient oak and closed my eyelids. I breathed deeply, letting the smell of damp earth fill my lungs while forcing my consciousness to sink beyond the limits of my skin. High above, the cold air currents hit the feathers. My eyes opened above the treetops, divided between the circular flights of Hugin and Munin. The forest stretched below like a sea of green and gray canopies. We glided together. Munin tilted his left wing over a rocky slope covered by dense vines. A thin line of smoke, almost invisible against the afternoon mist, rose from a clearing protected by tall thorn bushes. I counted the heads around the leather tents and identified the shapes of the sentinels perched in the branches of the peripheral ash trees. I pulled my mind back with a sharp jolt. My eyelids opened. Perseus's boots crackled on the dry leaves beside me. They are 2 miles southwest, I said, standing up and brushing the tree bark off my pants. Hidden behind the stone wall of the dry stream. We advanced the last miles on foot, pulling the horses by short reins to reduce the sound of hooves. The woods closed in. I raised my right hand, closing my fist. The group locked their steps. Kevin, I called, lowering the tone of my voice. Climb up and hide among the trees, neutralize the enemies without killing them. The archer nodded without making a sound. He ran to the nearest oak, drove his boots into the bark grooves, and vanished into the thick foliage at the top. Are we flanking the sentinels? Perseus whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his new sword. Or do we crush both positions from the front? I let go of the horse's reins and tied the leather to a tree trunk. We are not going to attack, I replied, loosening truth in its scabbard. We are going to talk. Keep your blades loose. Their first mistake will be answered with steel. Perseus furrowed his brow, his fingers squeezing the weapon's leather. Morgause and Belzacar exchanged a quick look, but nodded. I walked in front. The wolf and the shadowcat flanked my legs, their paws sinking into the mud without making a sound. Perseus covered my right flank. Belzacar and Morgause closed the rear. The wind hissed through the leaves. A sharp buzz tore through the air. The steel tip of an arrow brushed my right cheek. The shaft drove deep into the wood of a trunk half a step from my face. The vibration of the bowstring still echoed. The heat of blood ran down my skin. Don't you dare take another step. The deep voice descended from a small slope ahead. Dry leaves crackled. 4 figures stepped out from behind the thick bushes and high roots, blocking the path. The leader occupied the center. A portly, broad-shouldered man with dirt-soiled brown hair and beard. He wore a scratched iron breastplate. The metal displayed the worn paint of a coat of arms, a black winged hart on a gold field, surrounded by a black embattled border. Simon Toyne. To his right, a man wore thick rags mixed with asymmetrical pieces of rusted armor. His deep, dark eyes bulged in his disfigured face. There were no lips. The absence of flesh exposed his teeth and gums in a constant, sickly expression. The smiling knight. To his left, a massive, fat man breathed heavily, his immense fingers gripping the handle of a warhammer that sank into the mud from its own weight. Big Belly Ben. Right behind them, a young woman kept a firm posture. Her fair skin contrasted with the forest's dirt. Her green eyes locked onto my chest. A small scar cut across her oval cheekbone. Wenda, the recurved bow in her hands pointed to the ground, with an arrow already knocked on the string. If that boot steps in the mud again, the next arrow pierces your eye, boy, Toyn warned, his hand resting on his leather belt. Do not underestimate Fletcher's aim. The archer remained camouflaged in the foliage above. I raised both hands in the air, flattening my empty fingers. The blood from my cheek dripped onto the collar of my black doublet. Fenrir bristled the fur on his neck and released a low growl. Do you know why I came? I asked, my voice flat, without altering the volume. The ravens sing on the roads, Wenda replied, pulling the bowstring a few inches. They say our presence took away the Mad King's sleep. The ravens are right, I said. We were hired by the crown to put you all down. Let me introduce the hunters. My name is Arthur Snow, son of the Lord of Winterfell, Rickard Stark. I lowered my right hand, pointing to the side. This is Perseus. In the back, Morgause and Belzacar. Toyn tilted his head to the side. His eyes swept over Perseus's darkened chainmail. Son of the Paramount Lord, Toyn repeated. He crossed his arms over his scratched breastplate. Tell me, boy, does your father like you enough to pay a ransom's gold? Enough to empty the coffers, I replied, my lips curving into a short smile. The leather of Perseus's boot crackled in the mud. Arthur, you forgot a name. Ah, my manners, I said, looking back at Simon Toyn. I apologize, I forgot to introduce Kevin. The smiling knight turned his lipless head, analyzing the empty trees around us. His dirty hand squeezed the hilt of the crooked sword at his waist. And where is this Kevin? The psychopath's voice came out dragged and sibilant, leaking air through exposed teeth. Right behind you, I pointed. The four bandits spun on their heels. The wind hit the branches. Kevin was crouched on a thick root behind the group. He pressed the smooth blade of a short sword against the neck artery of a Brotherhood scout. His left hand kept the edge of a dagger forcing a second man's throat against the dirt ground. Found these two sleeping on the perimeter, Kevin said, opening a shameless smile. A pleasure. My name is Kevin. I like women, generous breasts, and those perfectly round asses. The steel hissed suddenly. Toyn, the smiling knight, and Ben drew their swords and hammers in a synchronized movement. Wenda stretched the bowstring to her ear, twirling the arrowhead toward my chest. Release Fletcher and Ulmer. Perseus's hand flew to the hilt of his new sword. Morgause raised his steel-lined shield. Calm your hands, I said, my voice tearing through the noise of the weapons. If I wanted you dead, Kevin would be introducing himself and Fletcher would already be bleeding from his back in the branches up there. I came to talk to you. Toyn held the raised steel for long seconds. His broad chest rose and fell beneath the scratched plate. He pressed his lips together and loosened his grip. Lower your weapons, his voice sounded harsh. The others hesitated. The smiling knight emitted a hiss through the gap in his teeth, but sank the rusted blade back into its leather scabbard. Wenda lowered the bow. Ben loosened his fingers on the hammer's handle. Great. Dialogue flows better without pointed blades, I said, relaxing my shoulder posture. I'm all ears, Toyn asked. He narrowed his eyes toward my boots. What do you want to offer? It's simple. I want you to join my band, I said, advancing my steps in the mud until breaking the distance, stopping an arm's length from the four. I need capable blades. Silence weighed beneath the treetops. The wind hit the dry leaves. Join you. Toyn's voice thickened in the back of his throat. He spat on the dirt. Why would we do that? You're nothing but a starched hunting hound serving a mad king and a lineage of incestuous bastards. The wall or the dirt, I said, my tone flat and low. Understand your position, Toyn. I only kept the steel in the scabbard because I know your trail. The Brotherhood spared the peasants. Your targets were the gold wagons and the full pantries of the lords. If the villages were bleeding, I would be bagging your heads at this exact moment to roll them at the feet of the one you call mad. I squeezed my right glove on the dragonbone hilt. Do not confuse an offer with clemency. Either you accept, or you march to the perpetual ice of the north. Toyn's dirty hand returned near his waist. His thumb caressed the iron of his sword's pommel. And who is going to drag us to the wall? Toyn provoked, his chin raised. You. The friction of leather hissed in the forest. I pulled truth in a horizontal arc, shifting my body weight onto my right heel. I twisted my wrist, turning the dark edge upward. The flat side of the Valyrian blade cracked against Toyn's right temple. The force of the impact carried through my arm. I did not break the motion. The sword's extension battered the smiling knight's ear, clashed against Ben's jaw, and struck dryly on the side of Wenda's forehead in a single fast rotation. The vibration of steel battering bone and iron tingled the bones of my wrist. The four stumbled backward. Toyn staggered, his knees bending and sinking into the mud before he managed to lock his boot. The smiling knight brought his hands to his ear with a pained hiss. Ben rubbed his fat face. Wenda blinked her red eyes, shaking her dazed head. I rested the blade on my shoulder. If I had used the line of the edge, all four would be on the dirt with a torn neck, I said. Do not judge my gentleness as weakness, Toyn. Truth's tip still rested on my shoulder. Hela's thick fur brushed against the short bushes behind Wenda. The Shadowcat closed the rear, fangs exposed. Fenrir advanced from the right. The direwolf's claws cracked against the exposed root of an oak, tearing the wood's bark. Perseus, Belzacar, and Morgause tightened the circle from the left. The mud gave way beneath the hard leather boots. Toyn blinked hard. The red, swollen mark throbbed on the temple where the steel struck. Oswin Longneck bled on the ground a few moons ago, I continued. He dragged half the band into the ditch in that last ambush. 6 remained. The peasants cleared your tracks on the roads. The spikes of King's Landing remain empty because of the village's silence, not because of the Brotherhood's strength. Big Belly Ben's breath whistled through his flattened nose. The smiling knight showed his exposed gums. His hand trembled over the hilt of his crooked sword, his eyes jumping from the tip of my steel to Fenrir's massive head. The robberies reached the ears of the Red Keep, I said, my tone unaltered. If my band didn't crush this camp today, the white cloaks of the Kingsguard would clean it up before the next moon. Knights drowning in steel plates, with swords that do not strike with the flat side to spare lives. I lowered truth. The metal hissed cutting the wind until the sharp tip stopped half a span from the damp mud. I demand service. Your steel will belong to me, I stated. You keep your necks intact. When the work in the shadows ends, I will return the freedom you seek. Another chapter. This one had over 7,000 words, I hope you enjoyed it. We present Tobo fucking Mott and the infamous Kingswood Brotherhood. To be continued.